Good evening, everyone. I call to order the meeting of the Open Source Voting System Technical Advisory Committee of the San Francisco Elections Commission. Today is Thursday, September 21st, 2017, and the time is now 6:02 p.m. I'm the chair, Chris Jordanek. Secretary Chan, can you take the roll?
Chris Jordanek.
Here.
Larry Profundo.
Here.
Carl Hay.
Here.
Ron Catal.
Here.
Tony Wasserman.
Yep. Here.
All are present.
Okay. Next item.
Item 2, general public comment. Public comment on any issues within the committee's general jurisdiction that is not covered by another item on this agenda.
Okay, seeing no members of the public. Next item.
Item 3, approval of minutes of previous meeting. Discussion and possible action to approve minutes for the August 30, 2017 committee meeting.
Okay, I just want to thank you, Secretary Chan, again for doing an excellent job.
I will
very long meeting.
I will keep trying.
I agree with that. I did spot one thing that I thought was a mistake in the minutes, having listened to the entire 3-hour recording because I wasn't there. I'll have to find exactly where in the minutes it says, but early on in the minutes it says that Colorado is deciding on what license to use for the RLA system they're building, and I think the minutes reflect this as Colorado is deciding what kind of general public license to get, which is
Not
both
general.
which is a specific statement trying to be a general statement at the same time. So I propose that we strike the words general and public from that sentence.
And I have a proposed change in section 9. There's just a grammatical goof in the next to last sentence of the top paragraph. It says, when about international and open source voting systems, probably we should insert the word asked.
I'm sorry.
On section 9, line 6.
Okay,
Line 5, rather.
got it.
Okay, anything else? Would someone like to make a motion to adopt the minutes with those two changes?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay. Any further discussion? And seeing no members of the public, Secretary Chan?
Member Janai.
Yes.
Member Profundo.
Yes.
Member Hague.
Yes.
Member Catal.
Yes.
Member Wasserman.
Yes.
Passes unanimously.
I found my thing, by the way, was section 4, line 4.
Got it.
Okay. Next item.
Item 4, member reports. Member reports on committee-related activities not covered by another item on this agenda, including but not limited to last election commission meeting, Department of Election progress, research findings, and news reports.
Okay, I will start off by saying a few things. I wanted to mention a few documents that are part of the agenda packet and just kind of go over those. So for starters, there was an article in the Chronicle on September 4th. So it's on the first page of the Metro section, and it mentions our committee. Nice. And actually the reporter was the one that was here at the last meeting. And then at the last meeting, Carl had asked about the costs of the EMS and the voting system, and I included two documents. One of the documents was for voting systems. This is some research I'd done a year or two ago, and I've just been updating it.
So, I guess I wasn't sure which, like the contract is for which systems, you know what that encompasses?
Well, for the EMS, it's listed in the memo, the text portion of the memo. It's the contract with DFM.
Yeah.
So that's. Did you want to know like the name of the product? Or?
No. Well, you have the Dominion system for vote counting, and then you have DFM, and I know what DFM is,
Yeah.
but I wasn't sure like which.
Like model number or?
Well, there's 2 pages here
Yeah,
for costs, and
The
so
first page is only for the DFM.
so the Appendix D fee
Yeah.
schedule, that's DFM.
DFM's contract.
Okay, that's about what I thought it would be.
Okay. And then the second page this is all going to Dominion. It covers all the voting system stuff.
So this is the scanners and software for Boat County.
And the accessible links, yeah.
And I'm guessing that the number that in the tiny column is the number of elections that occurred that year?
Yes, exactly.
So I guess the even numbered years have a primary and a general, is that right?
Yeah,
And then the odd numbered years have mayor elections and referenda and such things.
yeah.
And then even in 2017, when there was no election this year, we only paid $480,000. Okay, I misread that.
Okay, so what happened in
Well, there's
2017, they extended the contract.
Yeah.
So they increased,
Oh, the per year total column is a cumulative average. Okay, I now understand the nature of that column. That was confusing. Yeah.
yeah, so, and there was a law where they consolidated every other odd year election, so they eliminated.
Yeah.
that.
Okay. Yeah.
So I was going to look it up, but do you happen to recall how many precincts, how many polling locations there are?
On the order of 600,
Okay.
and a little bit under 600. And then there's another document. This is 2 letters that Fred Neeson from Disability Rights California submitted to the commission. And the reason I included these is because it lists sort of the preferred sort of accessible interfaces for a voting system. And just to kind of give you an idea, this joystick, audio, what's called a Tekla switch.
Yeah. My initial thought when reading was that a Tekla switch sounds scary.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
from a technical security perspective.
What switch?
Tekla, I guess, I'm not sure.
It's, quote, a wireless device that lets a person with limited to no hand movement control electronic devices such as a smartphone, tablet, or computer, and driving controls of their power wheelchair using their external switches. It seems to imply that it's kind of an input device that's meant to be plugged into a variety of different devices. I don't know. I didn't actually have time to go to the website.
Mouse equivalent.
Maybe. I haven't gone to the website, which clearly we all should, to check out what it is. But it sounded a little bit too much like, this is just like an arbitrary USB input device that your thing should support, which gave me which scared me a little bit. But I should look at that more and see what it actually looks like.
I mean, if it's the equivalent of a mouse, then even if somebody intercepted it, it doesn't.
Yeah.
A wireless mouse.
Yeah, a wireless mouse.
Okay, and then also this is useful because it sort of does things like it defines accessible, and it's just a good reference document.
So this will become a requirement for phase 1 rollout of any implementation that is contracted for, right?
Well, depending on what is built during that phase, yeah. If it's not a voter-facing component, then
Right.
it'd be part of it. but-
So I just wanted to interject, what the Election Assistance Commission is working on is a new set of voluntary voting standards guidelines, and that includes, I guess, disability access. So they're not, it's not a law, but most likely there would be strong pressure to adopt those guidelines or include that. So that's probably something that we need to, I think the 5.0 version came out a few years ago, I think 2015 maybe. I don't remember exactly, but they're posted and they're working on a new revision now.
You mean the 2.0?
Well, I don't remember which number it is, but if you go to Election Assistance Commission,
Okay.
I think I might have even included, well, there's a link to the EAC, and if you just go there, you can see the current guidelines that were released a few years ago.
So putting on our advisory committee hat, do we want to, in our list of recommendations, include something along the lines that the contractor or whoever has to have somebody who has deep knowledge of the disability laws and is able to incorporate those into the system requirements from the outset?
We could. I just, let's,
And maybe this is
Yeah, let's stick to
Something
the
to
report.
come back to later, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
So, yeah, I just want to kind of finish up on my reports. But,
Sorry about that.
that's no problem. Yeah, so there's those letters, and then also just kind of on the administrative side. So I think everyone now should have received information about how to like log into your email account. And what I think would be good if everyone could do is like once you've done that, to just send an email to like me and Secretary Chan just so we know it's working. And then also let us know if you'd like your email address to be listed publicly on our website. That way people can contact us. And then once we receive the email, we'll know that it's working. And then the other thing is you've all been invited to our GitHub organization. And at least in the early months, we're not, just until we kind of work out the sunshine implications, none of us are going to be using it. But if you'd like it to be listed publicly under your profile, there's a set of instructions for that. I think a couple of us are listed publicly, but I just want to let you know that's actually an action you have to take to turn that on. So then what? Okay, so that's all I have to report. I did want to say something about the VSG, but I'll let the other members speak first, because you had brought that up, Carl.
Oh, okay.
I can go next, if that's okay. I mostly have a few questions and one update. The update that I'll give is that I'm probably going to visit a friend for Thanksgiving in November, and he lives in Concord, New Hampshire, which is a entertaining location for the purposes of this committee, given that it's the capital of the only state that's rolled out any kind of open source voting system. So if we decide that we should speak with anyone who's based there, then please know that I'll be there in 2 months. And as for questions, you mentioned the GitHub organization, Chris. Are we actually able to author pull requests on that, or should we just email you with things for a discussion at the next meeting?
Yeah, so, and also I think I might, in my report, I think I blurred between the reports and the administrative item. You might want to.
Yeah, okay, that's.
Do you want to come back to that? Or?
We can come back to that in the administrative section if that's okay. And then I have another question that I don't think quite fits in the administrative section. When I was at the commission meeting yesterday, and also in other literature and things about this topic, I saw and heard the term remaking ballots. Could someone explain to me what that means?
Do you want to talk about that now?
Sure. Did you want to say something?
I mean, I can explain my understanding of what that means. But I've seen this process for Los Angeles on election night. And if a ballot comes in that's like crumpled or something like that, or obscured or marked like incorrectly, they'll remake the ballot so they can be counted.
Okay, so the optical device can.
Yeah.
Okay, I see. And what kind of like safeguards are in place to?
There are safeguards. I'm not super knowledgeable about that.
Okay.
But there is a process to make sure that the relevant counting gets taken care of.
Right, but this doesn't happen at any kind of scale. It's just for anomalies.
I actually don't know the level of frequency in which it occurs, but I would imagine it's not too frequent.
Right, it's not intended to be
Right.
scale anomalies. Okay.
It's more or less trying to preserve the voter intent and making the best judgment based off that to ensure that their ballot's counted. It's probably pretty standard, I would think, across the different types of election models.
Kind of related to that topic, so let me just jump in. The election modeling group of the NIST that's working on these voluntary voter standards, they're defining the process that you go through, including counting. And now they actually use 3 different terms: interpretation, tallying, and tabulation. So they all mean something slightly different. So interpretation means, looking at the ballot and is it marked, is it not marked? So it might be done automatically, but then maybe the machine will say, gee, it's not like completely covered, or there's something wrong, so they'll spit it out. Then they have to go to a manual process where they apply some sort of predefined rules to see, what it is. And then, they might have to remark it, for example, if it wasn't marked correctly. Then you have tallying, which is actually counting groups. And then tabulation is where you take all of the tallies and combine them together to get your final results. And then that whole process is called canvassing.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for those explanations.
Just one more tiny thing. I know that remaking process, they do have a process where multiple people have to check.
Okay.
if it's done correctly.
Yeah. I heard a very quick description of it and it sounded very scary, so I was wondering what it was. That's all I have for this item.
Okay. And
Well, I have some things to report. So one is, I was working on a glossary, but since we're talking about terms, I'll wait on that. But I also, when I was looking at the links to add, I went to all the sites and read them over. So one thing I found was a description of the voting equipment that we have now. So it's actually a holdover from ESS. But Dominion bought ESS, so the machines are actually ESS machines. And the way it works is they have kind of a container like a garbage can, and the lid is a scanner. So you basically feed the paper into the scanner, and it'll scan it, and it might spit it back saying, oh, you undervoted or overvoted. And then it prints out a little tape to say, what was wrong, or else it just accepts it and then it dumps it into a receptacle inside. And I think there might be two receptacles, one if it has write-ins and one if it doesn't have write-ins. Then after they get like 700 votes or something, the poll workers take a key and they unlock the side door, and then they take all the ballots out of the bin and stuff it into a bag. And then they zip up the bag and it goes to be delivered. So if you go to, I think it's verified voting, you can see pictures of the equipment or the videos on the county website for poll worker training, also demonstrate the equipment. So I also looked at all of the other open source projects and kind of what they're doing. So I can just kind of summarize, if you want, what they're involved. So the Colorado RLA, it's called risk limiting audit. So the intent was that you grab some statistical sample of all of the ballots, rescan them, and so the open count software, that's the open source software that's made to be a general purpose scanning tool. And so it works, you put in blank ballots and then you identify what the marks are supposed to look like, the unmarked areas, and then it'll figure out where those are. Then you go in by hand and say which mark location means what for tallying. So it's kind of a manual process of figuring out which marks
are you
correspond
sure
to what.
they're going to use open count as opposed to a hand count?
They used open count as part of that process.
Okay. All right.
I guess they also have a manual procedure, but the open
I
count.
thought the point of the RLA was to have software like OpenCount scan all the ballots, come up with a tally, and then have a statistically generated sample that you hand check against those. It
may be. I'm not sure if they scan all ballots or just the sample.
Okay, yeah, I read the paper I didn't look at the details of that project very much, but I read the paper for the RLA because I wanted to understand the math better.
Okay, so maybe I'll have to reread
so
that to see exactly what they do.
The experiment that they did, and I'll come back to this in a later item actually, but briefly. But the experiment that they did in the paper was for the Merced mayoral election, which only had like 7,000 votes, so it was a pretty small election. They had they retained all the ballots, and they scanned every single ballot and sent that whole file of 7,000 scans to a PhD student, who then wrote some software to interpret them and made some close calls by hand. So he came up with an unofficial tally that was very slightly different from the official tally, but still had the same winner. So the claim of like this person became mayor was the same. Then they took a small sample of ballots randomly selected that they then like dug out of by like ID number, dug out of the stack and checked them against the PhD students' interpretation, the software interpretation of the ballot. And when a sufficient number of them match, you can conclude with however many % confidence that that at least the end result is correct. The top line result of this guy became mayor is like 99 point whatever % likely to be true.
So anyway,
that's what they did
Colorado, they contracted with another company. The company name is Free and Fair, and they're the ones that, they have several different open source voting projects, but one of those now includes OpenCount. They also have a pseudo random number generator, which is what they use to, you basically roll dice to seed a pseudo random number generator, and that gets you the sequence of random ballots. So I looked at Los Angeles County. They hired a design firm to design a new voting booth that includes a tablet computer with accessibility add-ons, and then a printer scanner. So you're given a blank ballot page. I guess that's the serial numbered special paper. So after voting, it sucks in the paper, prints it back out so you can see what it is, and then if you say okay, it sucks it back in, scans it, and then dumps it in a ballot collection box. So it's very fancy. They're actually not, they just did the design, so they're soliciting people to actually build it. I'm not sure what the status of that is. Then there's the Prime 3 system, which basically it uses, it's been in use, that's the one that's been mostly in use, and they used it also for an accessibility voting device. And it just consists of a laptop or tablet and a printer. And so you can also use a phone app to make your ballot and come in with a QR code, and then you can just scan the QR code, and then it'll print out the results on an official ballot. I think the LA device is supposed to do that as well.
Isn't
So
the
the-
Prime 3 just it uses the browser as implementation?
I believe it's written in JavaScript. So it's, just took a quick look, so I think it just uses regular JavaScript to do the voting, and then it creates a PDF file that can be printed. So there's one difference between a few of these systems. A lot of them, instead of having a regular mark scan that has all the choices listed, they'll just print out the results. So they'll have each contest with one line showing who you selected for that. So you can either have a normal optical scan where you mark it, where there's like one spot for each choice that you mark, or if you create it through an electronic means, then it just prints out a smaller version with the selected choice one line per contest instead of one line per choice.
So the Prime 3 system is only about printing, right? It doesn't do any scanning or counting or any of that sort.
Right. It's just for, well, it also records the choices electronically. So
Okay,
you
so
can
it has a count of the
later
accessible votes.
either recount it or scan it or whatever.
On
But
the-
it's,
Where does it store the records? Not on the device, right?
I believe so.
Isn't that illegal?
Well, the official ballot is a piece of paper. So this is just a supplemental, and
I'm saying like the JavaScript stores.
well,
No.
the other thing is I'm not sure if the
Sounds like a
the ballot paper itself might have a barcode or QR code on it as well.
Right.
So it's a combination of scannable and machine readable.
And human readable as well, like you
Right.
can go
So,
and
but
count those things.
it's been used in quite a number of elections. Like that's the one that was used in the New Hampshire election that people have referenced, and it was used in several others.
But that's for accessible voting, right? So like, not even a majority of voters are using that system then.
I believe that's what it was used for in New Hampshire.
Right, unless the phone app became like rapidly popular or something, but like, it sounds like there's still a significant number of people voting on paper then in New Hampshire.
Right, so I think this was like a experiment or
Yeah,
something, as opposed to a full scale.
I think it's actually a great exercise in modularity, but
Yeah, Then there's the Travis County system, which I don't know if there's the notes that I gave you.
Yeah, they're in
We have
item
that.
6, actually. Or the second half of item 6 is the ones that you're
It
talking about.
includes the links. Oh,
Yeah.
okay. So I have some more notes, just small notes there. So it works similar to Prime, but for this one, you have to vote at the polling location, but you can bring in a QR code to seed and print your ballot.
Mhm. So once again, because that wasn't explicitly mentioned there and I didn't have time to read the link, once again, you can do a QR code, but it will then print the ballot and you have to like physically look at it and verify that it's right before you cast it, right?
Right, well,
Okay.
and also, the machine actually casts it, and then when the scanner that goes into the ballot box, it doesn't actually scan the ballots,
Right.
it just scans an ID code
Yeah.
to say, this ballot sequence number was deposited in the box.
Well, this is not actually developed, though. This is just.
Right, and it's actually, this one is also just a design,
Mhm.
and they're looking for someone to implement it,
Yeah.
so. It's just a proposed system that was, basically some people got together and said, here's what we should have.
Right, but I can see where they're coming from though, because the human readable part of the ballot is printed, like the person casting the ballot is going to inspect it to see if it looks right. If it doesn't, they'll complain. And if it does and they cast a ballot, then you're protected from funny business by doing something like a risk limiting audit or some sort of
Right.
some
So
sort
that's
of
kind of
test.
the way the LA system works, except it sucks it back into its
Yeah.
own machine in the voting booth.
Right. And then as to the well, actually, I'll get to it later. Never mind.
Did you have more to say on this?
I think that's all I was going to mention.
And also, Tony, did you want to talk about last night?
Oh, yeah, but are we still talking about
Just member reports.
agenda item 6? No.
Number 4, actually.
Okay, we're back and forth. So, so I was the designated representative to the Elections Committee meeting last night, and Ron was also present. So all of the members of the commission were there, and one of the agenda items was for us to report on what we're doing. And so I gave a brief report and mentioned first that we would like to understand how we may have the opportunity to interact with and potentially influence the selected vendors, starting with Slalom after the paperwork is completed. Because, personally, this is a discussion I had with Chris even before I joined this committee is, the committee is one item, is one phase removed from the people who are doing the work. Because we are reporting to the Elections Committee, which is overseeing the contractor's work. So I expressed that certainly for myself, and I suspect for you, that we'd like to have a better path to communicating with them, and that's bi-directional, where we can offer our own expertise without it being, with it being advisory rather than being directive. And then, of course, in the other direction to learn what they're up to. And so I made that, I think, the key point. The other thing last night is that
How did the director respond to that?
I don't think that there was much of a response. I think they were still trying to understand where we were. Nobody objected, but then nobody applauded either.
Okay, well.
Except perhaps for the president.
Well, I asked him later in the meeting, he said that he expected that they would want to be learning things, so he thought it was a good chance that,
This is Arnst,
yeah.
yeah, the Director of Elections, yes.
So continue.
Okay, good. And then we had various members of the general public who came and made statements about the concerns that they had of proprietary vendors getting involved, and also recommendations about what kind of programming technology we should use. And these were all, I think, given as advice, but not actionable at this point. That's, I think, all I have to add. Did you want to add?
No, I was only there for the first hour, so.
Well, me too.
Oh, okay. Well, I left before you, so I don't know where you lived.
I left as soon as Mr. Cherno got up to speak for the 4th time.
Ah, I didn't keep count.
Okay, well, and thank you again for being there.
Sure.
You did a great job. And also you for coming.
Thank you.
So, is there anything else on this? I did want to mention a few other quick things. I'll be as quick as I can. I'm going to be speaking at an event in Berkeley on the weekend of October 7th and 8th about the open source voting project. I was invited, and the Department of Election, or Director Arns said that he expected that the contract would be finalized in about 2 weeks or so. So just so people know, and that would be the point at which there could be official interaction. And then lastly, I noticed on Twitter that LA County, they apparently issued some sort of a new phase to their RFP. It's called something like, they want to have something like verified, confirmed vendors or some term. It's like, I don't know if it's an RFP or not, but interested persons or confirmed vendors for going forward. So that's, documents are online.
I have 2 updates for me.
Yeah, you didn't go to.
Yeah, 2 quick ones really. Chris and I talked about this a little bit too, but I've been in talks with some folks at 18F about to either have someone here come and address the committee, or maybe I could interview them and bring those points here in an update. But namely, the former Secretary of State of Missouri, who's obviously dealt with elections in the past and is part of our acquisitions group within 18F. This is like a consulting arm of 18F that advises states and local government on different types of contracting and procurement strategies. And so specifically, I'd like to come and help us think through what are some modular procurement or agile contracting strategies that the city could consider for an acquisition of a system. And so I'm going to really make a hard push to either have her present to us at the next meeting, and I'll work with you folks on getting that on the agenda in advance so that we have enough time. The only issue is it's a little late. She's in Missouri, so it'll be late for her. And if that doesn't work, then either we could maybe consider an earlier time frame, or again, I can just bring the updates and I can write them out.
When you say it's late, you imply that there's going to be some kind of telepresence involved.
Yeah, that's the plan.
So you have to check that with them too, I think.
Because ideally we'd have some questions and Q&A time with her.
Because I think we discussed that before and it was shot down pretty hard, but I think members of the committee might be different from public people as well.
Yeah, I confirm that presenters are allowed to be over video, but not
Okay.
attendance of members.
That makes sense.
The other thing really quick that I did was contacted Dean Logan, who's he's Director of Elections for Los Angeles. Is he like registrar? So he's heading up the county, the LA County voting modernization project that you mentioned in your update. And I asked him if he would be willing to share the software solution design document that was created as part of that project. I'm not optimistic that they will share that, considering that it hasn't been made public already, and considering that they've backed away from this idea of branding the system as a fully open system. However, if they were willing to share it, it's pretty similar to what we ultimately will be producing. In fact, it's way more detailed. Goes into the specific components of the system, talks about their purpose, their design, how they work together as a system, how information flows through the system, as well as more technical discussions around how the thing's going to work. And
so let me just add another thing that I maybe didn't say, that the
design firm, I mean, they're a design firm that did it, and it looks like some Apple designer created it. I mean, it's very fancy, but it looks very expensive, and it's all custom, you know, like a custom-built voting booth with a kind of custom-built touch computer and device and custom printer scanner and ballot collection box. Whereas like the Prime 3 system is just, you know, ordinary printer and off-the-shelf computer.
Yeah.
The Travis County system is kind of just it's nebulous. Although that's more super high-tech, they're trying to replace paper altogether and go to, you know, completely electronic. So
I think LA is a different case. Like they designed for a much different scenario than I think what San Francisco would need.
But I don't. Maybe they spend so much money.
Yeah, but
that they can afford to. You know, I mean,
right.
Custom-built hardware maybe is within their budget.
Yeah, but this document I think would be a good reference for us. Not something that we would I think seek to model one for one, but. Again, if we can get our hands on it, it'd be great. I
agree. I think it would be great to see more detail.
At least inform the design of our eventual deliverable. I think it would give us some ideas.
It's kind of also a test as to how open this project really is. You know,
Yeah, if they're not able to make that public, then what are you doing?
That's true.
so, okay, well, great. Let's open it up to the patient members of the public that are here. If anyone would like to comment on this item.
I'll just make a couple of comments. With regards to the Colorado risk limiting audits, my understanding is that some of their earlier pilots of risk limiting audit that were fairly isolated did involve rescanning ballots, do what you call a transitive risk limiting audit. So it's the official count does one thing, then they rescan them again in order so that they have a method of locating specific physical ballots that have been selected for the risk limiting audit. And the problem was that, at least at that time, the equipment they have, when they did their first scanning, they didn't have a good way of being able to, given a selected ballot from a set of CDRs, confidently being able to, or efficiently being able to track that back to a physical ballot. My understanding is since then, they've done some equipment upgrading across the state. And I'm not quite sure if with this new statewide pilot that they're going to have to do the transitive audit or whether they're going to be able to select directly from based on the scanning that is done as the principal scanning.
The process that I described for Merced for the mayor election was also a transitive audit. They, as I said, they took all the ballots, scanned them again with different software, and then audited that count instead of the real one. But since they declared the same winner, it ultimately doesn't matter for proving of the winner won.
Okay, so continue with public comment.
So about remaking of ballots, I did a lot of observation after the March 2016 primary, and it's not just when there's a stray mark or it's crumpled. If you're, for example, a provisional voter and they're looking at your registration and you voted on a Democratic ballot and they determine that you were of a different party, they will remake your ballot and you won't it's not really a very pleasant process to observe. The second one is the LA system, as far as I know, because I communicated with Dean Logan, will be a central tabulation system. So I guess they have this fancy machine, but it's going to record something, but it's going to be calculated.
Basically what they're looking at, there's a scanner in each voting booth has a scanner as well as a ballot collection device.
No, that's
okay, so I don't know why you would say that.
That's not entirely. Well, the electronic ballot marking device that LA has is just that. It just produces an electronic version of what the user has selected, but it produces a hard ballot. And that is what is ultimately counted at the central tabulation center. There are no votes counted in the device or stored on the device or in the precinct. Everything gets transported as an output of this system to central tally.
So the device doesn't create a electronic cast vote record?
No.
Oh, maybe I mean, that's why it'd be
The
good to
tally
see
system,
these
the
details.
tally system does it when it scans an image of the ballot and it's stored in the tally system, which is air gapped and separate from
Let's
everything.
let Mirka finish, because
Sorry.
this is your only chance to speak.
Sorry about
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. Like, you got this super fancy machine, it's not gonna really actually do any tabulation at the polling, like, at the voting center. LA also, for 2020, will have voting centers, but not the automatic all vote by mail, which I thought was weird. Like, that's what some of the other counties are doing. They're gonna get, everybody gets mail ballot. And if you want to go to a voting center, you could do that. But in LA, it won't be like that.
So you can't sign up for permanent?
Well, you
mail?
can, yeah. It's just that you have to know about it.
Okay. All right, thank you. No worries. Okay, all right, so let's move on to the next item.
Number 5, administration. Discussion and possible action regarding administrative issues, including but not limited to attendance at election commission meetings by committee members, in committee meeting schedule, and the committee's website.
Okay, so, yeah, on this item, I mentioned a couple things I should have mentioned during this item. But, and I'll just, the things that we're going to need to talk about during this item are when we're going to have our next meeting, who's going to attend the next commission meeting, which we've already decided, and I know, Rowan, you had a question in the last item.
Yeah, that was about the mechanics of us suggesting updates to the document, yeah.
Yeah, so I'll answer that question, then we can
Okay.
continue with other things. But so what I was thinking for that is, for now, let's just I'll do the updates to the repository, and then, but maybe like in a couple of months or so, maybe we could experiment with maybe like we can alternate, like have different members be responsible each
Okay.
month to kind of like rotate through or something. But what we want to avoid is having multiple people doing this between meetings, because then it looks like we're collaborating between.
But it sounds like it would be kosher to do something what Carl did, for example, is he wrote a piece to be added to the document and then sent it to you for inclusion in the agenda. And
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And then if he can hold on to a markdown document and then just
Right.
email it afterwards.
Yeah, I guess this doesn't quite get to the convenience of I create a pull request against the GitHub repo, but I guess if we do that, then it's very easy for people to accidentally comment on it, and then we're in sunshine trouble.
Yeah, so, and we can, over time, we can maybe see if we can do that. I just want to talk to the attorney about it more.
Yeah,
Okay.
sounds good.
I
I would add to that, by the way, that we should, and this probably, the actual action for this belongs more to like item number 10 or something, but I noticed that like 90% of the recommendation document writing for so far has been done by you. So I think that's a task that we can also format in pieces as long as it doesn't require coordination to take a load off you a bit. And so one thing we might want to discuss in item 10 is like what do we want to write about next and who does what?
Yes, I agree with you.
Yeah.
Okay, are there any other comments in this item before we work on scheduling the next meeting? And so we agreed, Larry, that you'd be the person at the next meeting. Can you still do that?
What's the date?
It's October.
I believe it's 16th. Was it the 16th?
18 is a Wednesday.
Then it's the 18th.
Okay, cool.
18th.
I can also make that if needed.
I will be a basket case that day. I'm flying overnight the 17th from Delhi to Singapore, and then early in the morning on the 18th to here, arriving early in the morning.
I'm doing almost exactly the opposite of what you're doing, but on the 20th, so I'm good.
I apologize, but that week, the 18th, I'll be at a mandatory meeting in DC that whole week.
Okay. I'm available the 18th, so I can do that.
Great, so then,
Maybe I could swap with the, yeah.
Yeah, you might have to do November because I won't be, well, it's not that I won't be, I might not be around November.
Let's tentatively put me down for November then, or
Okay.
I'm happy to do November.
okay.
Unless anyone knows off the top of their head the date for November.
The date for November?
Yeah, is it just the third Wednesday?
15th.
Oh, okay, I should be around then. But yeah,
Week
let's
before
say that
Thanksgiving.
tentatively you'll do November, I'll do October, and
Sure.
then we'll figure it out next month. That's the 18th, yeah.
Okay, and then how about scheduling our next meeting? Do we have, Secretary Chan, did we have a tentative date for that?
We did not, well, I didn't do a poll of the members to see what's available for them. It was originally, it's scheduled the day before Thanksgiving, the fourth Wednesday, so that's not gonna work for
No, for
anybody.
October, for October.
For October? October here. I'm sorry. We do not have a date.
So, Rowan, you couldn't make
Mhm.
the fourth Wednesday, is that right? for
The
October?
4th, is that the 23rd?
25th.
The of
You're gonna be
October.
gone, right?
Oh, of October, yeah, I'm gone that week, yeah.
Mhm.
I could do the 11th, probably.
I'm gone.
Okay. I could potentially do the 5th.
It's too soon.
Okay. Are you gone the whole week, second week of
I'm
October?
away the 10th to the 18th.
Mhm. I'm away the 20th to early November.
Okay.
So Thursday the 19th, nobody.
You might be a bit jet lagged, but if you're able to survive that, then
Yeah, I'll be all right.
What's the date we're talking about?
October
Thursday,
19th.
October 19th?
So basically, we repeat what we did this month, do it the day after the election commission meeting.
Does that work for everybody?
Doesn't for me, but
Or doesn't?
I'm flying back that Thursday. Let me check on my flights and see if I can get in that day.
And then what days are you gone that much?
I'm gone from the 20th until
Okay.
like into early November, and he gets back on the 18th.
Okay.
So the 19th is the sweet spot, unless we go very early in the month before the 10th.
Like the first week of October?
It would, yeah, because the 9th is a holiday, so
Right.
we would be talking about the first week of October otherwise, which is like 2 weeks, less than 2 weeks from now.
Second isn't it, so that would be the 4th or the 5th.
Yeah, 4th or 5th or so. That would only be 2 weeks from today. I don't know if anyone cares about that.
Let me see if I can move my flight and get in back early that day.
Okay.
On the 19th, okay.
Okay. Or maybe we can resolve this, by email if,
Mhm.
once we hear back from
So
there.
are we allowed to use Google Polls?
Yeah, we can do that for scheduling, whatever.
Administrative task, would they come under sunshine also? I mean, they're not like,
No, that's fine, we could do that. Okay, let's, so tentatively, we're gonna do the 19th, and then if we can find something better, we will. Okay. All right, anything else on this administrative? Okay, members of the public comment? See none?
Excuse me,
Yes.
do we want to try to set a date for November now also? Or
Sounds like the 15th. Is that what he said?
the 15th is when the Elections Commission
Yeah,
meets.
that's the election commission meeting.
So.
Well, would it be the
so-
16th then? That's what we didn't do.
So will we meet the 16th? or-
That will work for me.
You don't want to meet Thanksgiving week.
no.
Yeah.
Okay,
No, you don't want to try that.
all right, so let's do the 16th then.
All right, so we're just gonna, this is turning into a tradition here, just the day after
Which
the,
kind of makes the 14th of December be the de facto.
yeah, it ends up just de facto being a day after the elections commission,
Yeah, Or
right?
the 20th. 20th is getting late, but,
Okay.
Oh, in December.
yeah.
14th, I leave the 15th, yeah. 14th is a Thursday, yeah?
Yeah.
15th is a Friday. I leave that Friday.
So 14,
I know I'm gone for an unreasonable amount of time in December, but 14 will work for me.
so 14 December is a candidate date.
If others are able to. I realize not everyone can look that far into the future.
I don't know.
13th is the first day of Hanukkah, will that affect anybody?
Yeah, bring presents.
Okay.
I'll let
Okay,
it
so-
know.
Okay, well,
Okay, so we
We'll
have,
bring 'em in
we
there.
have something for December too now?
the
We
14th?
hit, you know,
This is all tentative, right?
my idea was that we would put a placeholder there So that we could put it on our calendars,
Yeah.
so we didn't schedule anything that conflicts personally,
Sounds good.
and if we end up changing it, fine.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Okay, so let's move on to the next item.
Number 6, project terminology and resources. Discussion of possible action regarding project terminology, including the meaning of voting system and resources for additional information.
Okay, so this is an item because at the last meeting, Carl had suggested adding some descriptions to the links that we had selected to start out with. And I also was on an email list, and someone emailed the definition of a voting system from Hava, and I thought that was something that might be useful to us. And I also just decided to go ahead and add the text from the document that I'd made a part of the packet for the last meeting, which was sort of like a rough cut at what components of the voting system would be. Just so we have something to.
I had one comment on your submission for that, Chris, because there's 2 items in this item, right? There's your submission and Carl's.
Yeah.
I had one small comment on your submission.
Can we hold off?
Okay, yep.
And then,
Go ahead.
And then Carl, do you want to talk about what you submitted?
Yeah, so I wrote a glossary on election data terms, and I gave Chris my kind of work in progress. And he made the comment that maybe it covers a lot more than what we want to go into here. But anyway, I just printed out what I had, and I kind of wanted to ask the committee, other people for some suggestions or guidance, and then I can take what I did and pull up bits and pieces or whatever you think useful. So I just made a hard copy.
Your glossary is not in the agenda packet, is it?
No,
Right.
no, because I just
Yeah.
printed it here, and it's not
Okay.
really
Yeah, so this
needed
is-
for submission. It's more just
Are you allowed,
for
are you allowed to do this? I wasn't aware that was
Well,
allowed.
so there's now a third item in the packet. Let's give 2 of these to members of the public so they can
Yeah.
see. If you're going to make copies, you always want to.
Let's see how many I have.
Sure.
Yeah. But also, generally speaking, we should be getting these to you before the meeting, right? So that,
Yeah.
They can be in the agenda packet.
We can talk. We're going to talk about that. But
yeah.
so.
Also, so that we have time to review
So
them.
Carl, do you want to say something about the item that you included earlier?
Oh, well, I guess I was going to talk about the glossary in terms, but
Let's do one thing at a time. So
because we were just talking about that, but unless you want me to comment on the other thing.
well, let's do the one.
That's
that
the
you
one that's actually in the
prepared
packet.
earlier, and then-
All right. So all I did was I took the links that we had from before and just added some annotation. And then I also added some other stuff, links to the open source voting foundations and some election data organizations also. They're annotated.
Okay.
I couldn't see the links from the printout we had, so I don't know if mine are the same or different, but I pasted it in links.
Okay. Great.
I only have 12 pages out of 13.
There's nothing on page 13.
Okay.
Okay, so in terms of like how we can proceed with this, I thought maybe what we could do is we could start with Carl's links document, and then we can talk about the document I submitted, and then kind of after that we could talk about Carl's document he just gave us. 'Cause I think maybe give him, I think he has some questions about that. So. So why don't we discuss Carl's document and this links?
These are the things number 3, 4, and
And 5, yeah.
I think it looks great, Carl. Thanks a lot for preparing this.
yeah.
And if you have any suggestions or mistakes or something, let me know. But
And this includes the 2 links that came up at the last meeting that we didn't want to add before looking at it. But
Right. Not actually with those things.
the open voting consortium that Brent Turner mentioned, and also verified voting foundation that you might have mentioned that, Carl.
I think somebody last week, I don't know, mentioned that one, so that's included. Also, one of the things that was mentioned was the California Association of Voting Officials. And so they kind of took over for another organization. But one thing I noticed was the local agency formation commission sponsored a white paper study for San Francisco's open voting. And so there's a link to that report.
And that was conducted by CAVO?
No, LEFCO.
San Francisco.
Sorry, yeah, but what is the link here between LEFCO and CAVO?
LAFCO is the organization that created the report.
Yes, but why is it mentioned in the CAVO item?
There's no link there.
Okay, then why is it between C and D? It's strong, the way it's formatted strongly suggests.
It was advertised on the CAVO site like it was from them.
Okay. But it is actually generated by LAFCO, and it seems that CAVO in a role.
Well, Chris, you probably know the history of that document.
Yeah, so this LAFCO document is actually, it's already described and linked to under the history section. And because it's not really an organization focused on open source, I think it might be better to leave out of this.
Yeah, if we were going to link to the document at all, which it sounds like I think it's already included in the repository even, then we should at least, in this case, we self-host it, but we should have at least linked to it on the LAFCO website, not on the website of a relatively unrelated organization that happens to host the same report.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And also the formatting, I think, confused me, who actually read part of this report, into thinking that CAVO was associated with it somehow.
Oh, well, I thought it was associated with it, so.
Yeah, no. Yeah, so this is an official part of SFGov, LAFCO.
Yeah, I knew what LAFCO was.
Why don't we strike that?
If you can, or put it where it should be.
It's already in there.
Oh, okay, that's
Yeah,
fine.
yeah. Let's get rid of that.
Okay, so does someone want to?
I have some other comments.
Okay.
If that's okay. Just some minor things in the descriptions of some things here. For 3B, the voting systems assessment project, the LA County thing. I actually went and looked at their website. As you said, it's very slick. What I couldn't mention anywhere was the words open. What I couldn't find anywhere was a mention of the words open source. I have heard some people say that it's not going to be open source or disclosed source. Does anyone know one way or the other? And if we should probably say that if it's not an actual open source project.
So.
I think we should caveat that in the description.
Can I say a few things? Number one, I was also unable to find a reference in any of their official documentation. Although if you read media articles that interview Dean Logan, he's quoted as saying it will be open source. And also if you look at their RFI that they issued earlier in the year, it actually has a couple pages describing that they want it to be open source.
Okay.
But I've also heard him say that they want to charge money for it too, so
Yeah, it's not uncommon for projects to start out as closed source and then so that they can have a select team of people who are dealing with the code and then at a later date open it. And of course, the other thing is the open core models that a lot of companies use, which have an open source at the core, but the final product has some proprietary add-ons that allow them to distribute the core as under an open source license and then generate revenue from the add-on version. And that's really quite common among commercial open source companies. Not that I like it, but it is what it is.
Yeah, so I was hoping that more clarity existed around the LA project so that we could include a caveat in the
But I don't think
item,
we've heard
but it
that.
sounds like.
I don't think we know for sure that it will not be open, or that components of it will.
Yeah, I actually didn't mean to dig through the RFP, and I ran out of time because I had to go to the meeting.
I mean, but technically it doesn't say it's open source, it just says it's a related project.
Okay, fair enough.
I
mean, all the other ones in the list are, so that it's still, yeah.
Well, the Colorado doesn't actually have a license file yet.
That's true. That's true. We don't technically know what license it has yet.
So actually, what I saw, everything was done from free and fair, so that the GitHub on Colorado RLA is free and fair's GitHub.
Yeah, but there's no license file. It says that
Yeah.
they're waiting on the state to decide if it's.
Oh, I thought, well, maybe I looked in the wrong one, but some of it had, I think it's GPL3.
No, I mean, not the Colorado or RLA.
Okay. I mean, I was looking at free and fair's GitHub.
And there's
Yeah,
a
they-
license, of course, there's a license chooser, but, they probably already know what they want to choose.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, those are good points. And, yeah, okay, no further comments on that.
If you have any suggestions on wording too, or something that's confusing, I'd be happy to.
No, there was one other thing that I was confused about, but it was, when I reread it, it was actually right there. I asked about it earlier too, the New Hampshire system being only ballot printing, and it does actually say that right in the text. I just read over it.
Okay. And remember also, we can always change this.
We can always amend it, yeah.
So. Okay, would someone like to make a motion to, let's adopt this with the change of striking out the LAFCO line?
So moved?
Second.
Second.
Okay, seconded by Ms. Larry says first. Members of the public? Okay. Seeing none. Secretary Chen?
Okay, Chris Giordano,
Yes.
Larry Bufundo,
Yes.
Carl Hay,
Yes.
Ron Catal,
Yes.
Tony Washington,
Yes.
unanimous.
Okay. All right, so the next item is the one that I submitted around terminology. And-
No, it's, oh, sorry, yeah. Next sub-item, apologies.
So the first part is just a verbatim quote from the TAVA, and just for reference purposes, and then also this list of kind of like one choice of components. And then we can leave the glossary out of this discussion for now. That's part of Carl's, but
Can I ask really quick, and this
Yeah.
we can defer this later, but this text here, the one that I guess you started to add, or I guess it's part of HAVA's definition of a voting system. In any event, it begins to make some choices about the eventual system under things like hardware and software components. And like, I think it pre-assumes, or it assumes that like this system should have a distributed tally system or model. And I guess I was curious as to like our rationale about that, because it seems like we've already jumped to like that decision.
yeah, so.
But if that can be maybe a different conversation.
Okay, so that was, I tried to address that in the first sentence of this section, components at the top. It says,
Provides one possible way.
yeah, of listing the components of a generic optical scan digital voting system.
I guess in the second paragraph of 222, Chris, you list what your assumptions are for simplicity.
Yeah.
You might add there that you're assuming that there will be like precinct level counting or tabulation or whatever it's called. Because you,
Yes, right, so,
Or there could be.
right.
yeah, so I think, I mean, there's sort of two, sort of at a higher level, do we want to, I mean,
So the reason I think that this is fine is because if you go to the LA model where there is no precinct level actual tallying and all the ballots are transported physically to be counted in a central location, all you need to do is just throw away one component, right? It's easily reducible to that model. So I think it's good to describe the more exhaustive model, but I would suggest that in the second paragraph where you document what your assumptions for simplicity are, that you add that you're assuming that, and that if it's not the case, then you just get rid of some components.
okay,
So one area that I want to at least mention is the notion of commercial off-the-shelf hardware. Because my understanding is that the LA hardware is custom built, right? there's a whole range of efforts around open source hardware. And so now, depending on how religious we are about open source, there may be an issue around using the standard vendor's platform.
Sure.
And
Hardware vendor, you mean?
yeah, I mean, who's to say we should use an Intel x86 or an ARM processor, pick your favorite.
There's not exactly a market for a lot of these things.
Right.
Yeah, I think it directly conflicts with commercial off the shelf. There are a few open hardware devices for some applications, but there are very few.
Yeah, that's right.
So it's more or less a direct conflict.
There's an association, which we may, in fact, want to include in our directive. There's something called the Open Source Hardware Association that is trying to.
Well, I guess I'd mention one thing that's slightly different if you have open source hardware or you get down to that level, is that you could do a true secure boot. So one of the issues is on most all of the commercial off-the-shelf software or hardware devices, you can reprogram the firmware.
Yes.
And
You're building virtual machines, a hierarchy of abstractions.
so most of these machines have something called secure boot, which in some but not all, some of the machines have the ability that once you set it, you basically have to unsolder the chip and throw it away.
Right, which is why it's not easy to install on the next partition of
Right.
this machine.
So can I
But-
make a suggestion for this? This sounds like a good topic that we could, because hardware is not on the agenda for today, and maybe this could be a topic for the future.
That's fine.
And then
Yeah.
somebody you could even draft up some initial.
Yeah.
I don't have
So-
any. I just wanted to make sure that we noted that
Yeah.
there was a possibility of going all the way to the iron, as it were,
Yeah.
in terms of what's open.
Yeah, I would just say that the bit that Chris wrote here doesn't anywhere touch on commercial off the. Oh wait, it says if the computer is commercial off the shelf in some
Yeah.
cases, but that's an if.
Well, there's
But now we're going to make
item
recommendations.
4, whatever is there. But-
Yeah, but none of this particular recommendation doesn't include anything on commercial off the shelf one way or the other. So
Okay.
I agree we should discuss it, but it's not relevant to this.
That's fine.
Okay, so, and just one more thing I want to say, the intent of this is not to limit ourselves to consider, it's just more like if this is the way we're going, this is an example of this. But, Rowan, did you want to suggest the actual sentence for the one that?
Sure. Let's see.
Like a number 5 under 2221.
No. Under 222, the second paragraph, it reads, for simplicity, we assume the voting system uses pre-printed ballots as opposed to being a ballot-on-demand system. We also assume that in-precinct voters are allowed to mark their ballot with a pen as opposed to being required to interact with an electronic device. We could add a sentence like, we further assume the tallying occurs at the precinct, or words to that
So
effect.
actually, I disagree with that second paragraph. I don't think we should assume that.
Well, okay, so maybe,
I think we're making assumptions that make the system bigger, so that if the assumptions are violated, the system becomes a subset of what we describe here. I think that's the goal, right?
well, can I make a clarification?
Sure, go
This is not, the assumptions, it's more like, for the purposes of this list, this is not, it's not meant to the committee is assuming that this is how we should build the system. It's more,
Yeah.
this list is only valid with these assumptions.
Okay, it
It's not a
wasn't.
recommendation.
Yeah, but just the way I read it, it sounds to me like that. But
Okay.
I think I don't think you necessarily even need to make that assumption for this list that you have.
Which one?
Well, that it uses pre-printed ballots as opposed to ballot on demand, because you could still use standard laptop, desktop computers. Well, maybe even might want to add printers.
Well, so for example, you don't have a ballot printer, right? Like if you had a ballot on demand system, you would have a device in there that generated ballots.
Well, you
And it's
need
not
a,
in
you
there.
need a printer. You need to
Yeah.
add
But that's not
off-the-shelf
listed.
printer.
Yeah,
It's
but-
not in the list.
Right,
Exactly.
That's the only thing
That's
you'd
why
have
we
to.
need assumption, I mean.
Well, but
Yeah.
I mean,
But what I think what Chris is saying, he's making an illustration of of a system, and for the purposes of that illustration, he's like saying like let's assume the system works in these ways, and then this is what you'd get.
But I mean, I think it's even not so good to make that limitation here, because I mean, many of the other example systems that we were discussing earlier use printers on site.
An alternative way that we could go about this is list more components and say if the system has this quality, then you don't need this component.
Yeah.
Or you have either this component or that component depending on what kind of system you have. Like the printer, for example, the thing that generates ballot is mutually exclusive with the accessible ballot marking device, at least if you take that technically and go for the marking.
Right.
Like you either have a machine that generates ballots, or you have a machine that you stick an existing ballot into and it marks it. You will never have both.
So, I mean, Carl, how would you feel like if we added a sentence in the first paragraph saying this section is not meant to limit the types of systems, to constrain the types of systems the committee is considering, but just for illustration purposes, would that be?
Yeah, except like, I mean, I guess you included a ballot marking device as one of the components. I mean, or you could even just add, if you're doing print on demand or electronic, then you need to add a printer or something.
Mm-hmm.
Or you could say that these components are representative of the components that are found in existing voting
Pre-printed,
systems,
yeah.
and are
Pre-printed.
not intended to suggest the solution that future implementation should take. So you make it clear that these are the kinds of things that exist, but whoever wins the contract is going to have to make their own decisions about what the pieces and parts are to make the Elections Commission happy. And
I was just trying to figure out how to say all that without
So
making three.
I'll make a proposal. I propose that after for simplicity, comma, we assume that we insert for the purposes of this example, and that at the very end of the paragraph we insert something like what you said. These assumptions are not.
The components
is for illustrative purposes only.
Based on the components that are typically that are found in existing voting systems. And it can be very brief.
Okay.
And are not intended to constrain the choices that a future implementation might make.
Okay, maybe like what you said followed by what you said.
Yeah, so I think what he said would probably go at the end of that paragraph, and then what I said goes after the fourth word.
Okay. So then, and then later we can maybe add more combinations.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Like future meetings.
Let's try to get like the minimum passable thing here.
I'm on board with that, but what do you think for future additions, like adding the ballot itself as a component? I think that would fit under HABA's own definition of a system. It may seem obvious. I know we talk about things that help enable the ballot, but the ballot itself is pretty important and would be defined.
I would suggest that if they're not things that would make you vote no on this, then you should write some text and propose it at the next meeting. And otherwise, we just try to amend this into something that we can agree on, and then move on for the time being, and then we can add more components and more examples, more permutations and stuff like that next month.
So I think your suggestion, Ron, was good.
Cool.
Okay.
If we're talking about the next page.
Which page?
2.2.222.
Okay.
I think there's one other thing that you missed that's also important. They call it the poll book. And so there's either paper-based poll books or electronic poll books. And what it is it's basically the list of registered voters that are eligible to vote at a specific precinct.
I have a question. Is it a piece of paper, hardware, or software?
Well, you either have software that creates the poll book or software that does an electronic poll book. So it's, I mean, the poll book is created with software, and it could have an online interactive implementation.
I think in the scope section, we had decided that the registration stuff would not be part of the voting system now.
I think that's.
But it's part of the voting system. It doesn't necessarily mean that.
I think it actually conflicts with Hava's definition of a voting system.
Oh, okay. Let me see.
And this is actually a deliberate, because this is like a lot of complexities around poll books and
Like electronic ones especially.
electronic ones.
So,
Yeah, the Hava definition doesn't mention anything about determining whether a voter is
Currently,
eligible.
this function is handled by our EMS, the DFM EMS.
Right.
I don't disagree with you. I think that it does fall outside the standard though, for some reason.
so
I mean, they talk about it in all the EAC stuff.
I know, but it's just, I would say this could like maybe increase the amount of our work by like, like 30% or something.
Oh, well, I'm not saying cover it. I'm just saying that it's a component.
Oh,
Not necessarily the deliverable for the project, but
I mean, I would actually, if we were to say it's a component of a voting system, I think I would disagree with that.
Mhm.
With the poll book.
So one thing that occurred to me is that in item 1 of 2221, we talked about some of these accessible interfaces to address the disability requirements. We didn't talk about the software support for those requirements in 2222.
That's a good point. Mhm. That's a good point. So I think what Tony is saying is that the software for the accessible ballot marking device is not enumerated under the software components.
Thank you. You said that much better than I did.
Yeah.
it just makes sense that you add a corresponding
Yes.
item.
Yeah.
Okay.
Shall we make some of these things to-dos for people to go off and write and submit in the next meeting?
Sure, or we could just say
Or you could just come up
accessible
with a
ballot marking
sentence.
device software and then just say the software to support.
Okay, yeah, if you want to propose very
Yeah.
very brief language, then we can do it
I would
right now.
just say, I mean, also there's the sentence in the beginning of the hardworking ones has a kind of.
Oh, in most cases we list. Yeah, okay, so you've got yourself covered there, yeah.
But yeah, I'll just propose we say accessible ballot marking device software,
Mhm.
bold, and then, this is the software running on an accessible ballot marking device
Right, and that would be 22229, yeah?
among those.
Or somewhere in 2222, it doesn't really matter where, but we should decide.
So it may not run on the device. We live in a world of distributed systems of cloud computing and the like, so that the physical device may in fact have a wireless connection to some other component which is running the software.
Wouldn't that be inviting all sorts of security risks versus
It
like?
may. I just didn't
So
want
you're
to
saying
say, I just didn't want to use the word here to say that it runs on the device.
There might be in California. There may
So
be
like a
actual
terminal?
hard limitations as to like wireless transmission of election.
I'm pretty sure that that's true, yeah.
Okay?
I know that's true with electronic poll books. Like I know it would be great to sort of update those in real time and
Fine,
and
good.
get to.
Yeah, I don't see how you can have a system like you described that wouldn't result in electronically transmitting like a vote, which my understanding is would be illegal.
What if, we could solve this by just saying, we don't have to say it's actually running on it.
Right, the software that presents the,
I think, to
use-
me, just the ballot marking device encompasses all the pieces. So maybe it's a PC or tablet, and then maybe there's a hardware box, and
So-
then there's like, with a bunch of giant buttons on it.
also, once again, this is an illustrative example, right? So it doesn't all have to be super accurate.
At some point, it could be some kind of wired set of glasses which lets somebody blink or look at a particular point and have that be sensed. We're going into a new generation of virtual reality and augmented reality where these kinds of things may come into play.
So anyway, I think just saying software for the device is fine,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
we don't have to distinguish,
How does it get on?
one piece of the device or another.
Right, I
How does it
agree.
get on the device?
I just don't want to constrain.
Is there a
all
different
this.
component for that?
do stuff.
Like that's configured and then,
I mean, I would see these commute to dos.
Alright.
Yeah.
Okay, so, all right, we have a number of suggestions. I think we've kind of, I think we're in agreement on the suggestions. Are there more suggestions for this?
We might want to agree because the suggestions for immediate edits, you mean?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, for today. Okay,
Yeah.
then, does someone want to make a motion that we adopt the terminology portion with the exception of the glossary?
So moved.
Okay.
Seconded?
Okay. I'm just going to allow the public to speak again if there's any comment on this discussion.
I have some things. I'll start with the issues of terminology, and I have some handouts that you can look at.
Are these,
One sheet of paper for each person.
okay,
Okay, there we go.
So, what I did was I gathered together some definitions and descriptions. In the top part of page 1 are some extracts from the VVSG 1.1 glossary. I was particularly interested in looking at both definitions of voting system and election management system. From the VVSG, the voting system definition is the same one as HAVA, pretty much word for word, except for the note that they added in at the bottom. But there's also the description of a voting system, or what for the California standards, that's a little bit different. I just kind of wanted to point that out. One of the key things here, and this doesn't, I think, necessarily have to affect any of your adoption, but I just wanted to provide this information for something that if you come back and maybe look at some of this later, that you have, it's not something to keep in mind. One of the key things is that in both of these, the term election management system refers to something that's entirely contained within the voting system. And so, or at least it has functions that are very much a part of the voting system. And it is not used in the way that I think is being used in the proposed document here, where it's something that is outside of the voting system, that is maybe only dealing with voter registration sorts of issues. And so I just wanted to make you aware of that difference, and if not tonight, I think at some point you might want to consider using some, look to what extent those differences in terminology usage is something that you want to make choices about, or find ways to acknowledge them both, or something like that. So for example, when you, in your list of components here, I think it was under software components in 2.2.2.2, item number 2, you have election definition, EMS integration. And that kind of is a usage that suggests that EMS is something outside of the voting system that you have to interface with. I understand that maybe in the San Francisco Department of Elections, that maybe that's a common usage, and so I don't think it's a clear-cut answer about what you do, but I wanted to make you aware of that. Also, in terms of the list of items here, two other things that you might consider as components, and I understand that to some extent you'd like to keep the list small initially here, is anything dealing with ballot adjudication, and to what extent that is something that you would want to consider as being I guess primarily a software component that runs on kind of stock desktop or laptop computers. And particularly with these newer voting systems, and I expect it to be true of San Francisco's open source voting system, that you're gathering actual kind of photographic images of ballots that might be used to facilitate some of that. And then the other item is the possibility of having a separate software component of Event Logger, something that's keeping track of audit trails across different other components, much as the way you have kind of a low-level device driver listed here as a component.
Am I allowed to ask questions in follow-up to public comments? I have one question for Mr. Carey. When you said adjudication of the ballots, does that mean, is that the process that would happen to every ballot or only a ballot that software cannot automatically interpret?
That would be cases where additional human review of the ballot is needed for whatever reason.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay, and also I just want to mention, Mr. Kerr, you have a GitHub account, right?
Yes, I do.
So when you'd be eligible to...
Yes.
take
If I put this together earlier, I would have done something. At least mail it to Don so that he can share it ahead of time.
Please do for next month.
For the late contribution.
I want to make one quick comment. So yeah, it is true that the Department of Elections is using the term EMS to refer to their DFM system, which...
What's DFM?
It's a company that...
Oh, okay.
That makes the software, and it handles the voter registration as well as like a little bit of kind of the contest definitions and things.
So actually in my
they're not
glossary,
really...
sort of by accident, it includes all of what the DFM system has in it.
Oh, and this third document, and
The one that I just typed.
Okay.
So the reason I handed it out wasn't to actually give it as a product, but more just so you could take a glance at it and give me some guidelines on like which things, would we want to have, which things maybe to prune out, or which things to add.
Okay, yeah, so we'll talk about that in a moment. I just want to make sure we finish this other. I think we're in the middle of the vote right now.
Yeah, we are.
But so the last thing I want to say, so the department's using the phrase EMS in a way that's not the same as VVSG.
It's in the document. It's not directly in conflict though, because the things that this can include things phrase that all fits within the definition of EMS. The only thing is that this describes EMS as being external to the voting system, whereas the VVSG describes it as being internal. So we might consider rephrasing that to something like, it needs to account for the possibility that these things are external systems or whatever. And the fact that your EMS here in San Francisco also includes voter registration stuff doesn't even matter because that's not even
So actually,
in there right now.
The reality is that there's several different EMSs.
Mm-hmm.
So one is for voter registration. Well, some people use a different vendor for voter registration than candidate and ballot preparation. So actually San Francisco switched and now DFM does both. But then there's still, I think GEMS is the software they use, I'm not sure, for counting. So that's yet another. So EMS in the VVSG means like all of those things as one, but in reality they're different products from different vendors.
Okay, what if we, under the second component, what if we said something like DFM integration to make it concrete? Because I know the director has said he wants to stick with DFM. And
we could add that in San Francisco. That's what we're doing.
If you ask me, everyone calls those EMSs, so I think the way you have it now is actually the best way to word it.
Well, and also, I don't actually see in the VVSG glossary that Mr. Carey submitted, I don't actually see where it says that it does anything with voter registration. All the functions that it says in the very top of the Carey's glossary are the same functions that are mentioned in Chris's sort of inline semi-definition of an EMS in item 2 there. So I don't actually see the conflict, other than the containment relationship that Mr. Carey mentioned. I don't actually see it.
I mean, the conflict I see is that the EMS the department currently has doesn't do everything that a voting system EMS would need. That's the problem, I think. So it does maybe 20% of it.
Oh, right, because vote counting is also part of it. I see.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's.
Yeah, we could also say that it needs to be able to interface with an external system for these tasks or whatever, without trying to use the E term.
Well, there's still an issue of EMS integration because even if EMSs are multiple pieces, you still have to integrate.
Well, let's just.
So I think it's a
leave it
good
for
section
now.
that you have, and the way you worded it is fine.
Let's
Yeah,
leave it
I
for
think it's
now.
fine.
Okay. All right, so we have a motion then, to public comment. Let's, Secretary Chan.
Okay, on item 7, right?
Yeah. No, hold on, 6.
Item 6?
The second part of item 6.
Oh. Sorry.
Chris's submission rather than Carl's submission for item 6.
Then Chris Giordani,
Yes.
Harry Bufundo,
Yes.
Carl Hayes,
Yes.
Ron Cataldo,
Yes.
Tony Wasserman.
Yes.
It's unanimous.
Okay, so the next portion of this, let's discuss the glossary stuff. So Carl, so I wrote a list of some words that just kind of occurred to me as I was writing some stuff for today. And then Carl, you.
Well, I have a big
document.
list, and I
Yeah.
sort of agree with your comment that maybe it's like too much because it's kind of covers everything that's
Yes,
needed.
well, so why don't you describe what you put together and what your questions
Oh,
are?
okay. So, let me find my printout. So, this is mainly about data. So, the first section is just defining, the different parts of ballots and how they're made and some aspects of them. And then, so that kind of goes into detail, like what's on a ballot and, what information is there, what different kinds of voting methods there are. There's a section on some terminology used in election results and counting and reporting those. Then there's other ones involved with, I guess you could say geographic terminology used in EMSs, and then the different aspects of inside the EMS. And then I also added a section on cryptography in terms of security. So Chris thought maybe it's sort of too detailed, but maybe some parts of ballots are important. And also I think cryptography maybe is important because that's kind of the basis of establishing security if we have some basic terms there. But my question is just which sections do you think are useful to add, which pieces?
So, let me also cover this. First of all, it's a great job. It's really, I learned so much from reading this.
Well, the other thing is I can just post it on my personal website as a general glossary.
I'm glad that you did mention blockchain, because I think that's certainly an important piece of technology that is likely to influence future elections. But the other thing that I noticed is that the list that Chris created in section 6, for the most part, deals with the hardware, software, and not with the election process itself.
And actually, this doesn't even do too much with the process. It's more just data.
Right, but the listing of software and hardware components and bots and so on, it doesn't overlap very much. So that we could, in fact, extend this. We say open source software, but we're going to have people who want to talk about free software, and we're going to have people who want to talk about FOSS as both of them. So if we're, putting all these terms in, those probably should be included as well. But this is a lot of work, so thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Carl, for starting it. So we did.
So anyway, I'm not officially submitting it now. I just wanted to show you that as a work in progress for
That's
sort of
great.
general comment.
My main comment to Carl was that I thought a good rule of thumb for whether a term should be in the glossary is whether we actually use the term in the text.
Yeah.
So there are certain terms where I felt like it would be more part of a spec for data standards for contest results or something like like civil division or ward or special district, or like measure type. I mean, these are things that I don't really see us mentioning ourselves, but some of the more general terms like vote by mail ballot or canvas, things like that, like high level concepts, I thought would be really good for us to.
One wonderful example, because it's always hard making these glossaries because as someone who knows the terminology, you're blind to what other people don't know. One wonderful example, I think, is that neither of you thought to define the term outstacked.
What?
The term outstacked, an outstacked ballot. I actually
I
didn't
don't
know
know
what it
what
was
that
until
is.
yesterday. I didn't know what it was until yesterday, and it is it is not always obvious from context what it means. It's in neither glossary. So just for the glossary makers out there, please consider putting it on your glossary.
So we'll have to do research to find out what it means.
Well, you have a fine specimen of someone who's never voted in this country here, so.
Well, I just found about remarking, but so also what I wrote was not so much process oriented. So the NIST has a whole working group that's created a very complex model that's basically describes the whole process. And so there may be a whole bunch more terms, and a few of those terms come up in your list as well.
So how would people like to handle this, at least for today's purposes? Do we just want to let Carl keep working, or maybe based on what he's heard tonight?
Or I guess what I'd like to know is what would you like me to do with this? Like how much of it, or what prune it, or how do you have some suggestions for how to use it?
I like the idea of it being maybe an appendix or something that has a lot of this, definitional knowledge so that somebody can refer to it. But Chris's point that the glossary should include the words that are used in the body of the text. I think that's really what's important here. And so my suggestion would be to incrementally add to the glossary that Chris provided, and let you continue to work on yours with the expectation that we would find a way to provide it as reference material, if nothing else, to people who want to learn more about it.
I mean, my idea was that it would be reference material.
Okay. Yeah, I would suggest that we import like the parts of your glossary that are currently used in the text, like the ones that explain words that are actually used in the text of the document right now, and that as we go along there will be more words that you've already defined that we will start using because there'll be there's sections of it
if
written.
you'd like, I'm willing to take a crack and add like the list that you have. I might find a few more
That'd be great.
that we've already used.
And yeah, thanks for not submitting it for a vote because if it's 12 pages and I haven't had a chance to review it, then my vote is no.
I showed my work in progress to Chris and then didn't really have a chance to get it. So I just kind of wanted to know what I should do.
I think
I'll submit a real one that you can read in advance and
So
you may have some wording issues too, or things that are confusing. So I might actually like a session of comments first before actual voting.
Sure. I think also, I think this glossary sort of skirts the line between the glossary and like an overview of the process, because there's a lot of terms to find. We might also want to consider separating this between like a glossary with brief definitions of terms that are used in a document that might confuse a non-expert reader versus like, here's all this information, like more than you ever wanted to know about elections, which I think, as Tony said, could be an appendix. So perhaps we should aim to have in the short term a glossary that just explains it in a document as briefly as it can be for a reader who doesn't already know what the term means.
Right, and that's what I was volunteering to do that
Cool.
piece.
Yeah, that sounds great. And I think there's a place for this big thing, absolutely, because I will read it and like Tony said, I will learn a lot, but I think that place might be in appendix too.
And also, thank you, Mr. Terry, for preparing what you prepared. I think it's going to be useful too. So maybe, Carl, you could look at what Mr. Terry did. Okay, so, all right, is there anything else before we move on to the next item you want to say on this? Okay.
Just a quick comment. One of the ways you might organize this is to set up a document that is maybe kind of a proposed glossary pool with candidates that haven't been accepted yet, but are out there for members of the public to comment on or make suggestions about changing. And then that's as you start using some of these terms, and you maybe initially pull from that.
Mm-hmm.
Couple of pen kind of thing.
Sounds good to me. Oh yeah, I just wanted to briefly mention that as we discussed, especially as we discussed Chris's submission, there were a number of people that said that they would like to add one thing or another. So I would encourage you all to please remember or take a note of what it is you wanted to add and write it and submit it. I for my part have written like 3 to-dos about it already.
Okay. All right, so let's move on to the next item.
Item 7, project management and procurement.
Well, okay, sorry, go ahead.
Well, sorry, I'm late. One thing that just came out here is maybe you need to come up with a definition of a valid image, because I don't see it. And,
Oh, it's under valid, but not very precisely defined.
This is just working.
It's in
We-
there.
yeah.
This is not a, this
Yeah,
is
yeah,
not,
no.
this is just a commentary in general,
Right.
not yet at the level of suggestions
Okay.
in terms of content.
All right.
It's kind of in there, but I agree. Like the definition of a cast vote record makes some suggestions of what it might look like. It's on page 1, the 3rd item under C. And I think that might be more or less what you're talking about. If not, please correct me.
Well, there's a definition of valid image in the federal guidelines that is not intuitive. It's not what you think it is. So,
Yeah, the intent for what I was hoping we could include is the term for like what's like the photographic digital image.
Uh-huh.
So I called that a scanned image.
Okay,
Okay.
maybe is valid image different from that?
no, that's the intuitive definition, but
No, it's a cast vote record is specifically ballot image is a cast vote record, I believe.
But part of the problem is the federal definitions were set up before it was common to have photographic images of ballots in them. And so there's a lot of ambiguity at what is now kind of troubling overlap in some of that.
So it's even cast vote record is ambiguous, so that's why I put in, it could be
Yeah.
any of
So
these things.
maybe for our document, we want to have something that's unique from those confusing.
But I should look up what the, where did you find the official definition?
last year, the voluntary voting system guidelines.
Okay, I'll look at that.
Okay, so let's move on to the next item.
Item 7, project management and procurement. Discussion and possible action regarding project management and procurement.
Okay, so this item it was more of a placeholder because Larry had mentioned wanting to invite a speaker, and it wasn't clear to me if we were going to have that speaker. So instead, I thought we could kind of have a more of an open-ended discussion, because I think this is going to be one of the harder topics for us.
Mm-hmm.
And I did include just one bullet point that I thought we might be able to approve, but I thought we could maybe just have a general open-ended discussion about procurement and project management.
So I guess my question here for this section is, like, what is the focus of it? Obviously, project management. It's broad. Are we specifically talking about like risk mitigation with this topic? And in a lot of ways, it's not so dissimilar from the other section here, which is incremental approaches, section 9, which I can see as being basically a product of project management. Like, you would favor that approach because of these reasons.
It's really sort of
Not only
often kind of
Right.
idea.
So I think agenda item number 9, incremental approaches, is more of, it's a concrete division of components. Whereas project management. Procurement is more of like, what are the processes that the city can use? Things like, how do we outsource the management of the project? You know, how do we issue many small RFPs? How do we course correct? Stuff like that.
So it's like risk mitigation and execution is the purpose of this section.
Yeah, and I mean, at the last meeting,
Well, I think it's also, that's what agile development is sort of supposed to be about.
right, but how do we fit that in the constraints of the laws?
But actually, the way you put it is good. I mean, saying agile is bad, I think.
Right.
Well,
Yeah.
incremental is fine, and you know,
Mhm.
if you go back further in the history, you had this notion of as waterfall was falling into disfavor, you had Barry David's work about iterative and the spiral model, which have evolved, of course, to be this successive releases of products with increasing functionality until you're finally, you know, and then you walk a roadmap through that with successive releases, which I think is perhaps the common vision of how we'd like to see it. But in terms of what the voter will see or the candidate will see, it's kind of a big bang. It all is there and tested and ready to go.
But I think just as a project and managing the project, it still needs to be done like in these stages so that testing is really an ongoing process.
This comes back to the relationship between us and the elections committee and the director of election and the vendor, right? Because if the request for bids asks specifically for a schedule and you know, how you're going to go about this, and there's something to review, that's good. But and that should be a recommendation, right? As opposed to, oh, we like the people on this team and we like the amount of the bid, and so we're going to give you the job and, you know, deliver on such and such a date, which is the way that things were done historically. So I think, you know, we're coming at the same issue in several different directions, which is to make sure that when the contract is let, that it includes verbiage that says, you know, show us a series of intermediate deliverables that gets us from where we are now to.
So I think that actually goes to Chris's question, which is strongly related to item 9, yes, to the incrementalism. And incrementalism actually has benefits beyond what you said, beyond the risk mitigation and procurement, which Section 9 also outlines. It also provides value for the city sooner, and you wrote that all in Section 9. But I think one of the questions here that wasn't really answered, I guess you kind of assumed the answer, was do we, like you said, the contract, right? Do we have one RFP that is won by one vendor that gains one contract that then outlines like a timetable with iterations that like with intermediate deliverables and such things? Or do we actually put out multiple RFPs for different components to possibly different vendors for smaller amounts of money?
I don't think it's realistic to assume that we can get one vendor to do all this.
Right. Well, then they would possibly subcontract, but like you can
Plus
structure
the
it.
disadvantages of having a massive
Yeah.
RFP for all that.
But
Yeah.
I think a lot of times that's what people do is they contract with a single vendor.
Well, I mean, I would favor the broken up approach if that's not obvious from the way I said it, but
Yeah.
we haven't actually had that discussion.
I agree.
Right.
Well, let me just give you some of the realities here. So this
Mhm.
is what's challenging. Like, to take this RFP for this business case.
Yeah.
It's $175,000. It's like pocket change compared to what. And I don't know how many months the department's been working on this RFP. It's been like, I don't know, like 8 months, a year or
Mhm.
something. And it's like still not done. And to think like, if this is going to be broken up into a dozen different RFPs, I mean, it's
Mhm.
take forever.
So that, yes, maybe.
But I want it to happen.
Well, protestations I would offer is one, you don't necessarily need to have to happen all at the same time, although it still doesn't erase all of your concern. But also, like, to some extent at least, isn't it true that if it was one big RFP, wouldn't that be approximately 12 times as big as the 12 small ones?
Well, it might be more. I mean, so the analogy that I like here is the general contractor when you do work on your house. So, you know, you select somebody to be the general contractor, And when we had a lot of work done in our house, somebody would show up at the door each morning and, hey, I'm Manuel, I'm the painter, hey, I'm so-and-so, I'm the plumber. And they, the general contractor, whom we rarely saw except when we paid him, had arranged for all these subcontracts and experts to do the work. And that was a viable model because the final responsibility lay with the general contractor.
Right.
And so you didn't have to make 12 separate contracts.
Because
You
it's
made
their
one
job,
with the general
right.
contractor, and then he dealt with all this lower level stuff. And if it didn't work, it was on him.
Yeah, so one problem with this is, my understanding is that when the city awards a contract, the contractor can't just have subcontractors. Those need to all be spelled out in advance.
Why is that?
In their RFP response, or? So they need to spell it out in their RFP response,
Yeah.
who they're going to subcontract to.
Yeah, so, and that can be very difficult for a company to have to know in advance all that
Right.
they're gonna need to find, and especially if the deliverables aren't even known.
I can see where it's very frustrating, but I can see where it comes from, yeah.
But they could make one contract to hire a company to oversee the whole process and do the integration testing and things like that. And then they could help
Yeah.
write the RFPs and do all the other stuff, so that could be their job. And then the other RFPs are separate and maybe even change depending on the
Is that-
testing.
That's going to really make the calendar stretch out.
Is that something that's likely to pass muster too? Because at the commission meeting yesterday, the director discussed that he had to run the contract by a committee that decides whether, the city has relevant expertise or not to do the thing that they're contracting an outside vendor for. And the city quite obviously does have the relevant expertise in making RFPs, although we're short-staffed at the moment given the director's having to do it himself.
Yeah, well, but we're not just talking about it's also the whole acceptance testing.
Yeah, no, I understand that, but I'm just flagging that, contracting someone to do, among other things, help with RFP writing,
Right.
it is something that committee might reasonably flag as something of why are you contracting externally for this if we have city employees that can do this?
I mean, there are innovative ways in which this can be done. I'm not an expert in this area, but I work with people who are experts. And there are also ways of writing RFPs better, right? So they can be issued more quickly. But I think in order for us to start thinking about a recommended approach or even principles of an approach from a procurement standpoint, it would be helpful to understand, or I'm wondering if we need to make more firmer or detailed recommendations around the scope of a likely system, so people can begin to formulate okay, well, here's how I would attack that from a procurement perspective, considering that you have these components or these work streams, which will need these capabilities, which are likely not the same people, not the same vendor.
And Chris' submission for item 9 does outline a few of these.
And I think where I'm coming to is if we're also recommending in theory an incremental approach as opposed to a big bang release, where would we advocate starting first, and how would that inform the procurement strategy?
I'm concerned that some of these RFPs would be for relatively small amounts of money and may not be worth the effort that it takes to prepare a bid if they see it as being a highly competitive thing. Am I going to go
Sure.
to a lot of work for a $25,000 contract?
Same with the big one though too, right? That no one can realistically do.
Right, you need a mid-sized one. But
Do we have to worry about that now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, what I do think, just in terms of my action item for next month anyway, is I believe that a straw man sort of view of how we see this unfolding and how we would recommend where to start in terms of which components to tackle first and why, and the types of components that we would seriously or likely consider would help experts advise us on a realistic procurement strategy that we can then break down into principles, and put forward.
And I think we were going to get into that.
Yeah,
So
item 9
just
is,
let me mention, Colorado RLA, contract with free and fair. So that's an example of a vendor that can produce open source software at modest development costs. So they're an example that vendors do exist.
But there are other things too that could be in this, and I wrote down, which maybe I can take on as an action item. There's like principles of approach. Like personally, I believe that we should advocate strongly for the city having a project management ownership and role over this effort, and not contracting those responsibilities out. That it should conduct the effort in a way that's like open and transparent throughout. So like meaning like things are publicly visible, like we're conducting our business. The repo is like open, and someone's there to help manage the feedback that's coming in, or even the pull request as work is being done, and that they're engaging with the relevant communities. So there's like a project management / like community engagement aspect to this type of work, which has lots of benefits.
That could be a recommendation too.
Yeah.
And it has to be somebody who's run an open source project.
Right.
Because you have all these issues about who can commit and whether you make nightly bills available and all this kind of stuff.
Right.
The other thing is, so there's not only Agile from the perspective of dividing the project up into RFPs, it's like even in the context of awarding a single RFP, how do you make it so that the execution of that RFP is itself an Agile process? Because right now, the problem is that even with this business case, the director has to spell out by like law, I don't know if it's by law, but he has to spell out all the deliverables before they start. And from what we know about Agile, that's not how Agile works. It's like the deliverables change from, if you're doing Scrum, from sprint to sprint.
Mm-hmm.
But is that even allowed in the context of the city's procurement processes? So I think there's almost like a research component, which is like what are San Francisco's laws allow in terms of, and I'm hoping that there are people, experts in this area that can maybe give us.
That's a funny question. Can we be agile?
Yeah, quite long.
Well, one of the failures of healthcare.gov
Yes.
was that they said, we're going to do agile programming.
I mean, maybe it could be something like, this is just like a simple thing, but like, there's like an RFP template. You just do the template once, and then you just like fill in the blanks, and you can do like 6 of these really easily or something.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe there's a process where you have a larger RFP, and then the winners are like eligible for like subtasks or something.
Mm-hmm. You can select multiple winners.
Yeah. So, but it's
Right.
like I don't know.
Those are good things to find out. Yeah.
So do you know people that know about this stuff?
Plenty. Yeah. It's just I'll definitely take these on.
Cool.
Let's do public comment.
Also, yeah.
Go ahead.
Did you want to have public comment on the discussion we just had, or did you also want to introduce or vote the very brief text that you wrote?
Well, we're allowed to have.
I guess we're going to get public comment again when you do that.
If you see this text, you can comment. So it doesn't have to be a certain order, but.
Okay, yeah, I guess we can have public comment again when we vote on that. That's fine.
Yeah, we can have public comment, but let's do public comment.
Okay.
On the text itself that you have here, I'm not sure the example that you have is maybe quite the example you'd want to offer there. And a specific case in point is, I'm not sure that you'd necessarily even want to ask for a library to be developed in as a single deliverable, as opposed to developing it in states. My sense is that the department is going to have a hard time. It's going to be a challenge for them just to be a participant from a business perspective. Never mind running the development process. Just being a recipient of a custom designed voting system for them. And so one of the things I think you want to have in mind is developing things in pieces that are meaningful for them, so that they have a way to give you feedback about how things are going. And a library might not be the best way to accomplish that. Right now, off the top of my head, I don't have any good suggestions, and I think it's perfectly fine to adopt it as it is, as a starting point. The other thing I'll mention is that just as an example from some of the discussion you have, and I think this issue of procurement is an important topic for this committee to look at further. I wouldn't necessarily make the assumption that you contract with just one entity to produce a given deliverable. It's quite common in some areas of government procurement that you contract with two competing organizations, and you end up choosing whatever is the best one to continue with, so that you don't end up with early vendor lock-in in the development process. And also, I would certainly suggest that there are, one of the things that would be valuable for this committee to be doing is to be looking at how can the city improve its procurement process to allow agile development instead of presuming that whatever the rules are now are what we have to, this project and other projects, quite frankly, have to live with. So.
Okay, thank you.
Let's finish public comment.
The public? No?
To his point, one thing that we can consider, and I'm curious what the other people in the committee think of it, is instead of or in addition to referring to libraries, we could refer to some of the things that you've outlined in section 5, where you submit in item 9, where you talk about possible first components and componentization and incremental stuff. I don't know if that's what you were getting at here, or if you were going for a more granular level.
Well, I can just tell you what I had in mind here.
Sure.
So I actually looked at the Colorado RLA RFP, and I saw a huge opportunity for this there. So like one of the deliverables was like a software application that allows two-factor authentication, and then you log in and then you put in fill out these forms, and it spits out like the balance audit. But there was no but what about the library that actually does the actual function of choosing the priest? It's like there's these natural
Division points.
You can't to test it. You have to log in.
Right.
So, I mean, you could use software modules, including libraries, as the word. But,
Yeah.
I mean, I understood what it meant, so what you meant.
But so a couple of things struck me. One is, if you've identified these libraries or components, one of the process steps would be to try to find existing open source code that already does that, so that you reduce the amount of code that we have to write, because there's tested quality.
Well, actually, for some things
so
like
that, a recommendation or principle that should carry through is the notion that for any one of these components, there's an effort to identify existing open source components that's appropriate. Another thing that occurred to me is that if we're thinking about more than one RFP, we identified components of a voting system or election system that we call interpretation and tallying and tabulation. And those things are relatively distinct from one another in that we could think about clean interfaces between one and the other, so that doing some kind of a logical decomposition of the tasks would be, this traditional 1972 style top-down decomposition, and it would lead to the identification, perhaps, of some common infrastructure that would include these kinds of libraries. That would be the shared data repository or whatever it is that we need. So thinking about how a system might be structured is also a way that suggests a way that we might put out an RFP asking for the different parts and pieces.
So I can give you an example. There's encryption software, and actually part of VVSG is that you have to use NIST certified encryption software. There is an open source NIST certified encryption package, and that's basically what everyone uses. But then you might need a layer on top of that that's a library, so you could do things like take a cast vote record and produce a signed signature or a scanned ballot image and produce a signed signature. So the underlying libraries, they do the encryption, but then we need a higher level library that can take election data object, and maybe, also create like crypto chains, and then maybe there's a layer on top of that let's say when you initialize the voting equipment, it prints out a piece of paper that's, okay, these are the encryption keys that we're using today, and here's the start, and then at the end of the day, it prints out, the summary page, and then, locks everything down, and that's part of the record. So those are like 3 different, like all pieces that could all be released in different stages and then reused.
It also raises the question of whether the RFP or something has to be directive that says, in effect, thou shalt use this library.
Wait, you're saying it asks the question of that?
Well, I'm saying that if there are certain things that everybody uses and that are proven and well-known and perhaps standard.
Well, it probably has to say that it has to be like NIST certified crypto.
Well, fine.
But that's all you need.
Fine, but as an advisory committee, this is your expertise and experience. Does it find its way into the procurement?
But I mean, that also to go in, like you were saying, you want to break up the overall thing into those pieces. So like what I was describing is an example of how you might be decomposing it, even to the stage of subsystems that could be made separate deliverables and testables.
Like two other possible components. One is like a software library that does the RCV tally.
Mm-hmm.
It takes this list of customer records and spits out the round by round numbers. And then one other one is, it's just listed in one of the later documents, the ballot image interpreter. It takes a digital scan image and outputs the CVR. And that's a component that can...
It's evaluatable.
It's
It's evaluatable by lay people if you build a shim interface on top of it.
But yeah, and you need it for the precinct scanner, you need it for the central scanner, you need it for an adjudication thing. But I think David made a great point about the department doesn't really have the staff to evaluate if a software library is doing its job, because you need to have, an engineer that can like write a shim and write a test case.
Well, but you could make that a deliverable, right?
Okay.
You could say like you need to deliver this library. You need to, it needs to have a reasonable interface, but you also need to write a UI shim for it so that someone can take some data set from somewhere and just like run it through there and see that it produces reasonable results.
And it's a funny thing. Is around this table we have the expertise probably to architect large chunks, if not all of this. But we're not going to be the ones who are going to build it, and we're not going to be the ones who are going to go out and find the different open source components to be used. So we have to be careful not to over-constrain the choices that the vendors is going to make. So there's a balancing act there.
Yeah, to your point, I would say that we should be hesitant that we should approximately never say thou shalt use this library, but that we could say things like, we could be liberal with making suggestions for open source software that already does things. And in fact, Chris's submission for item 9, I'm sorry for sounding like a broken record, but does some of these things. It identifies some existing open source projects that do some or all of some of the components that he's outlined. And we could also say like, you should use an existing open source library for this component, or have a good reason for why you didn't do it, if we want to be stronger about certain bits.
Quick question is like, considering the lack of like open source voting systems that are in the marketplace, like do we hypothesize that we may need to build more custom units for this project in order to run open source software on it?
Custom units of what?
Custom components.
Hardware or software?
Hardware.
I think this is not quite resolved, I don't think, but part of the thing that's under discussion and might be in the document currently is a focus on commercial off-the-shelf hardware.
Right.
Because a lot of this kind of stuff, you would be able to just like buy a commercial scanner and run some software on top of it, or some software to interface with it. That software itself would be open source. So I don't think that would be terribly much of an issue. Like with laptops, for example, right? Like approximately any laptop can run.
You sure about
most
the
open source
scanners
software.
though? Because like, I mean, I know there's lots of devices out there that do the job, but
Mhm.
not all the devices maybe can like keep up with like the throughput requirements that
Right.
like an election
That's a
system.
separate issue, but.
Well, that's a constraining. Anyway.
Well, no, I mean, there's all kinds of scanners, but
Yeah.
like if you look at the current system, the scanner's embedded into the ballot collection box. So if there was a requirement that the scanner had to be integrated to the collection box, that involves some sort of custom hardware, at least packaging. Well, and even there might be some packaging, but then if you break it down to where the scanner's on a table, it beeps, and then you put it in a slot, then then you can use any kind of commercial or substitute or change it.
I mean, I think this question, the answer, I think we're not going to know the answer. We're going to have to hire someone to find out this answer, I think. So.
Well, I asked because I wonder how it also affects the procurement strategy. It's
Right.
like a build or buy sort of like analysis that would be part of RFPs.
We could do research to identify which things would reasonably have like commercial hardware available for which component.
I mean, could you do an RFP that's like, your task is to come up with this central scanner that as much as possible uses commercial off the shelf?
Yeah, describe it in terms of capabilities and let them figure out how to do it.
And then they're like, oh, it's all commercial off the shelf except for this one part we need to do a custom
Mhm.
change. And
So one of the things that Santa Clara County has, they have a machine that actually opens all the envelopes and unstuffs all the ballots and sorts them. So I'm not sure if that's specific to voting equipment.
Opening envelopes?
Yeah,
Well, that's mail, right?
well, but it's like open special ones for scanning.
Oh, I don't know. I can find out.
I mean, I don't know,
Yeah.
but that's something.
I think that, to Larry's point, I think we might want in some places to do some cursory market research for certain parts of it, like, it may be that there are certain hardware devices where there just isn't commercial off-the-shelf hardware available that could reasonably do that job, and there may be parts where there is.
So I had a comment related to that I was going to wait until we have future things, but one of the things that I was interested in working on was kind of outlaying the different options that there are in terms of, different kinds of equipment to be used in different processes and different ways of marking ballots, and how that works with different security models and all of that. But maybe I'll just sort of postpone it till we get to that
Okay.
subject. But I think that could help, because you could say, well, yeah, for example, if the scanner has to be integrated with the ballot collection box, then that's one choice.
Yeah.
And, or the other alternative is that you have to have a separate scan and ballot stuff. But that's just one of many different possibilities, so.
Another thing that we could recommend, by the way, just thinking back to the reason there's an emphasis on the use of commercial off-the-shelf hardware is that it should be as easy as possible for other jurisdictions to replicate the system. And if custom build hardware is involved and that becomes more difficult, we could recommend that contracts for custom built hardware where they are necessary, that if new hardware is developed, that be open hardware, for example. So that.
Do you want to write that up for next? Do you want to write that up for next month?
Sure, I will actually write it down.
And there's a cost factor. I mean, I think the Department of Elections is at least thinking about a certain amount to spend to get this all done, and just as buying a suit off the rack costs about 10% as much as having one made to measure. We have the same issue with custom hardware.
So I think also just in terms of scanning equipment and whatnot, there's kind of a difference, because a lot of the scanners that are made now are made specifically just to scan ballots where you have dots in certain places or arrows in certain places, and that's all it knows how to do. It's not an actual scanner.
It's special purpose hardware.
Yeah. Whereas if you take the architectural approach, like OpenCount, where you use a normal image scanner, so that the output is an
image,
color XY 2D image on two sides, then you reduce that to the rest of the process that's all in software.
Yeah,
And
that's-
that I think is a better approach.
Right,
than-
and then the
than
question
old
becomes-
style scanners.
Yeah, I agree, but then the question becomes like, how many, like, what market exists for high velocity kind of.
Oh, they have
scanners,
those.
right?
They're all.
I'm sure that is an example where
from,
that's.
like,
I'm sure that's
1,000
an
per
example
minute.
where that's easily available. Like if you have like 10,000 pages and need to scan them all, I'm sure there's a device that will do that for you. But when you get into more, because that's not a niche subject, right? Like lots of people have 10,000 pages they need to scan. But when you get into more niche things that are more closely related to elections, there might be cases where that kind of hardware is.
But like
not
precinct
available.
scanners, just $100 portable
Right.
scanner actually works great, and it's perfect for manual feed
Mm-hmm.
ballots.
Chris, are we taking the stance that the entire system must be open in order for it to be an open source voting system?
I don't think we've discussed that one way or the
Yeah,
other.
we've really talked about that, yeah.
The reason why I mentioned open hardware is not because I'm an open hardware fanatic. It's because one of the practical selling points that I personally see in this being an open source system is that another jurisdiction has sort of maximum ease in replicating and tweaking this system. So if custom hardware is involved, for example, then you could say like, well, the software's all open source, but to actually build another deployment of it in like LA or somewhere, you would need to buy this particular piece of hardware that's only available from one vendor, and then you might be screwed cost-wise, right? Whereas if the hardware plans was open, then you could put an RFP that says like, build me this thing,
Yeah.
and the vendor originally built it might say like, well, I have 10,000 of them sitting in a warehouse that I could ship to you tomorrow, but they might still have an advantage, but at least they're not able to price gouge the other counties, right? They can say like, they can put out to bid to competitors.
But
Let me come back to Larry's point, which is, do we mean that everything is open source? And so let me ask you a question. I'll answer a question with a question. Is Android open source?
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Mostly.
Close.
I think that's a good point, though. I mean, yeah, I think ultimately it's a branding thing, isn't it?
Well,
Branding and intent.
It's a percentage thing, I think.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And somebody who's particularly paranoid is going to say, well, what goes on in that little black box there where I can't actually see what's happening?
Right.
So when you say that something is, if we make the claim, or when this is built and the city makes the claim that we have an open source voting system, it's got to be, well, ideally it should be entirely open source.
Ideally.
But it may be that there's some piece of some hardware component made by some vendor
For cost factors.
where they're not, giving away the device driver code or something.
Mhm.
well, obviously things like a scanner, we don't know the firmware inside the scanner, and in theory they could hack the firmware in the scanner, and it would fake ballots.
Right, but there are in fact open source components that will drive standard scanners. You can throw away the vendors.
All right. Well, so I actually
Let's postpone the hardware
Mhm.
discussion.
Yeah, but Larry's question, I think, is central to our discussion, which is, when we say open, what do we, on the software side? And my question is Android open, as an example of being close but not quite?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think from a policy perspective, I don't know if we're the ones that can really
Mhm.
make that
I mean,
decision. But I think
so-
obviously,
Make
the
recommendations.
more that's open source, the better.
Mhm.
Well, and I could see, just speaking of open hardware, I could see like a small box that's like everything is completely open and auditable, that has security that could connect to a few things, but that's like a small piece. I mean,
Yeah.
but also I was going to say the VVSG and the EAC, they have certain rules about what off-the-shelf software can be used, like operating systems, for example. You can use them even if they're closed source or part of it.
But 9 out of 10 of the big cloud providers run Linux. I mean, maybe they run a non-commercial one like Debian, or maybe they run Red Hat, but it's an open source operating system, and my sense is that nobody's going to be happy if the underlying hardware runs Windows.
Okay, I wanna get back to the project management stuff. Yeah, so let's try to, so I think, well, for starters, how do people feel about this one bullet item?
That's fine. I'm reasonably okay with it. I think the language could be sort of revised to be clearer, but I'm okay leaving that for like as a to-do for you or somebody or for next month.
Okay, can you just say how it can be improved for future?
So like what we talked about earlier, like you said, you actually gave some really good examples about like the RCV software could be separate, like those kinds of components. And then I said like you can require you to build a shim around it, exactly, that part. If you
You could just
put that
say
in there.
software components, including libraries.
That too, but yeah.
Yeah, or, you know, we can talk about, be more technical, it says favor libraries and modules with published interfaces that can be tested independently of one another. So we get just a little more precise about.
Right. I think what Chris said actually goes a little bit into a more detailed procurement strategy, which we might wish to document there, because I don't know about the rest of you, but I like the idea that we sort of like riffed off each other and built there, of saying, and I think that's a really easy way that you can explain it to a layperson too. Like anyone who's going to read this document is going to be aware that San Francisco uses RCV and that most jurisdictions don't, and that like RCV tallying software will use like in-go ballots, outcomes, or income counts even, outcome like the winner. That is a separate component that will be separately testable.
Okay, so two options are we could either vote on the language as is, or maybe you could just delegate for me to write language based on what we've discussed.
And that you then submit next month?
Or I could just do it.
Or you just do it. I'm fine with you doing it. I have faith in your ability to.
The other piece that comes is what I mentioned earlier, which is favoring the reuse of existing components where available, as opposed to, as opposed to writing your own.
Okay, actually, that one is actually related to something later in this meeting under
Okay.
software design.
Right.
And then we could maybe add it.
But it seems to me 4 deliverables favor smaller deliverables, but also favor deliverables of,
That already exists.
yeah.
Okay.
So you don't have to write them.
Okay.
I don't know. Okay.
Favorite deliverables that don't need to be delivered. Okay.
Favorable, yeah.
I don't know. We can iterate on this.
Yeah.
Okay. So does someone have a motion for this agenda item?
I guess I would motion we adopt this as is,
As is.
or
Okay.
or some.
I'm happy.
Improvement over.
Yeah. I mean, also, I don't think that we're in a terrible rush. We just delivered our report to the commission. Next one's not due for like 2 to 3 months. So we could also just say we adopt this language as is, and then we send Chris off to write something else, and then we vote on it next month, right?
Okay.
So we're gonna be agile about it.
Yes.
Exactly. Come on here.
Every month we can make little progress.
Exactly. So yeah, I move that we just adopt this straight up then.
Okay.
All right, second.
Okay. So I guess we'll do public comment again. Just yes.
There's a clear tendency here to roll your own. The city would roll its own. And I'm not hearing much discussion about looking at what's out there. Sitting down and let the LA, Travis, Free and Fair, OSET, even University of Florida come in and say, this is what we have, this is what exists. And given that, I mean, David made a nice presentation yesterday of an estimated time of arrival, maybe 2032 or something, anything that could be done to speed that up should be looked at. I'm not saying that any of those vendors have a solution that will fit what San Francisco needs, but I think there ought to be something in there to take a look.
So actually, that's one of the issues I was going to talk about for future activity, was that I was interested in.
Yeah. Let's wait for the public to
Oh,
finish
okay, go ahead.
So, I mean, that's it. There's stuff going on. I know that somebody emailed the commission yesterday with a proposal for something, and that's like brand new. And so we don't know his name is John something, and we don't know what's out there fully. You had a great, fabulous session 2 years ago where these people came in and talked about what they're working on. That was 2 years ago. And I think there are at least some components, if not semi-complete systems, that could be looked at and maybe say, you know, LA, the problems, but LA, yeah, that'll get us 4 years ahead. We have to add an RCV component, but that's it. Maybe some kind of track of looking at what's there. And I think that's something that this committee is capable of doing, and almost chartered to do, to provide advice and see, well, we looked at blah, 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 and good, bad here, and take a look at what's out there, because there's some, at least components, if not near complete systems, that are evolving. That's it. Anyone else?
Briefly, one way to maybe look at it would be, you know, the vote by mail scanner. You know, I don't know if it's like 4 scanners that you have downstairs. It's like, that should be done first, you know, then you can focus on the precinct stuff, because, you know, we're probably all going to move to vote by mail, and maybe by the time you might not even really need to do that many precinct stuff. So we focus on the one that's counting most of the ballots.
And I will just repeat myself saying that I can't wait to get to item 9. Because Chris said exactly that.
Yeah, and Jim, earlier in the meeting, we did spend a fair amount of time going over some of the other projects you mentioned. And Tony, I think maybe for the next meeting, you can write up this thing about reusing or existing software.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's, Secretary Chiang?
Okay, on item 7.
Yep.
I call it roll call for this vote.
Yes, yeah. This is related to item 7.
Yeah.
Okay, so, Chris Giordani,
Yes.
Larry Bavunda,
Yes.
Carl Hay,
Yes.
Ron Catal.
Yes.
Tony Wasserman.
Yes.
It's unanimous.
Okay, great. Next item.
Item 8, committee recommendations. Discussion and possible action regarding committee recommendations on the subject of requirements, gathering, open source, software architecture and design, software development and testing.
Okay, so this section was sort of a grab bag of things that I've been thinking about this stuff for at least a few years now, and so the first couple months was just brain dumping a lot of stuff that has been on my mind. But this is just a grab bag of some things that I think are mostly I think it's pretty non-controversial things, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
So are these like topics that we should be making a recommendation on,
So-
or are these the recommendations?
These are the recommendations themselves. They're not like necessarily more important than other things, but just some things that were on my mind. They may have been related to things we talked about at the last meeting. But I did just add an assumption that saying the Department of Elections did state a preference for an open source license.
Mm-hmm.
So that's not coming from us necessarily.
For GPL v3 specifically, right?
What's that?
For GPL3
Yeah,
specifically.
for GPL specifically. And then it moves on to some recommendations. And let me just pull up. I'll just go through in order. Like one is this, at the last meeting, we talked a little bit about like decisions that need to be made, and actually, Larry, this gets to some of the things you talked about earlier, about like, is this gonna be a precinct tally? Is this gonna be a marking device versus a printing device? And I think there's sort of like a first cut of like major decisions that need to be made about whether, are we using pre-printed ballots, or are these ballots that are printed on demand? And this 5.2.1.1 just kind of lists this decision. And there's sort of different combinations.
So to clarify, it doesn't make the decision, but it says that is a key decision that needs to be made early on,
Yes,
correct?
this is a decision that needs, and I'm not sure, this is another thing, like we may want to make a recommendation. on
Right,
this decision,
but that's not what you're doing here right now. You're just documenting that as a
Yeah.
decision that's very important.
And then also documenting some of the considerations and pros and cons for
Yeah.
like different ways to go. So just very, very quickly, there's sort of three options, and the three options exist for both accessible voting and what I'm calling here not necessarily accessible. I wish there's an easier way to say that, maybe default voting, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know how we want to say it, but
Able-bodied voting, or I don't know, yeah. I like your terminology.
yeah, so, and I actually, I don't know, there's pros and cons. And then the next sort of key decision is this idea of printing unique identifiers on ballots when the ballots are scanned.
So, but usually if you, like the pre-printed ballots that exist now, all have unique numbers on them.
Well, remember, when a ballot is cast, it cannot have any kind of unique identifier. But it's only once it's inside the scanner.
I thought there was a serial number on the ballot and then there's a serial number on the receipt.
No, because that serial number needs to be ripped off before it's given to the voter, because otherwise you would compromise the secrecy of the ballot.
So you're saying that all these weird solutions to do with a scanner that like ingests it and spits it back out and ingests it again are all like workarounds for this legal issue?
I mean,
I'm not quite sure.
Sorry, you're saying there's a legal issue with having an identifier on the ballot before it is cast, and I'm now connecting this to a description of, I think it was the LA system or somewhere, where there's like a device that like ingests the ballot and then like spits it back out and then ingests it back in or something.
It's machine readable, not human.
Right.
Well, okay, let me just.
So is that a workaround for the legal issue? Is that why it's done so strangely?
Well, there's the legal issue of a ballot cannot have a unique identifier when it's cast.
Okay.
And then so, but the reason to print a unique identifier, and I should have said this earlier, it allows risk limiting audits to be done, or individual ballot audits.
Yes.
Otherwise, the only alternative would be that you have to like carefully keep all the ballots in order.
Yeah.
And say like, I want the 232nd ballot, but then that's liable to like getting stuff out of order.
so I mean, one issue in terms of security is how do you know someone hasn't taken the ballots and throw away the original ones and put in different ones? So if they're printed on some sort of special paper and they have sequence numbers and you can count how many papers you have and which sequence numbers then are used, then that's kind of a way of keeping track of what pieces of paper exist.
So,
Well, do you need that though?
But I mean, it doesn't mean that that number is linked with a voter.
okay, well, it sounds like you're talking about a couple of different issues. One is ballots getting swapped out, and that's a secure, physical security issue.
Right.
But that's not, unique identifiers is not meant to solve that point.
You mean written on the ballot
Yes.
as it's cast? Yes, I agree, but that's why I was saying if it was pre-printed and they did have, some sort of number on them, so each piece of paper is different and can be tracked.
Okay, all right, so let's step back for a second. Do you understand the reason why there shouldn't be a unique identifier on a ballot when it's cast?
Is the idea that if it does, then I can fill out my ballot, take it outside the polling place, show it to somebody, collect my money, and then take it back into the polling place and cast it? Or some variation of that
You
scheme?
can basically sell your vote.
Right.
If there's a unique.
Right, whereas if there wasn't, because then later, because a lot of these approaches also have APIs to tell voters that the ballot with this sequence number was really counted. So that would give you that would actually make vote selling easier, not more difficult. Whereas, if the identifier isn't on there, you can always destroy the ballot and cast a different one as the voter after you collect your money. So you don't.
Yeah, well, okay, there's a couple variations to this. One is called chain voting, where the identifier is it's sort of stripped off before it's cast. But but the more obvious one we're avoiding is where it's existing on there when it's cast. Like that's not allowed by California law. But I mean, it's just basically if a ballot is in the bin, there shouldn't be a way to tie that back to the voter.
Yeah.
But I mean, if it's just a random number, how is it tied to a voter?
If the voter, well, you have to think of the voter as adversary here too. The voter is trying to sell their vote, and they're trying to convince somebody that they definitely voted a certain way. And if there's a sequence number in the ballot, then the voter can collect their blank ballot that has a sequence number on it. They can fill it out. They can sneak it outside of the polling place and show it to somebody, or they can show it to someone who's with them in the polling place. And then they can then cast that ballot, and the city will then provide a helpful API that tells you that the ballot with that serial number was really cast. So that gives you vote buying where the person whose vote is bought is able to prove that they cast that vote. Whereas the way that it currently works, you can't prove that, because even if you show that ballot to somebody that you're about to cast, you can always spoil it and have it destroyed and get a different ballot and cast that one. So that's, correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, but I that's my understanding of the motivations behind these mechanisms.
Yeah, and there's also ideas of like posting the ballot images online for people to look, and if it had a serial number there, someone could, and the poll worker is going to see the serial number. That's another. But this is like an assumption. I mean, this is part of law. I actually can't. I don't know the number of the law, but
Yeah, it's a hard constraint.
yes, this is not like a negotiable.
Although with LA, I think they apply a ballot ID, they reapply a ballot ID at the point of tabulation. Like the scanner, the tally scanner, for some reason, I forget why.
A random one.
Yeah, for like additional, for auditing capability, I guess.
So I thought most of the systems that
It's
submit
disassociated.
electronic cast vote records include some sort of ID.
But it would be generated on the fly after the ballot is already scanned. It's not tied to the voter.
Right.
Well, it's right. It's just it's tied to the voting machine.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you can probably derive the precincts from other information anyway. Those images might even be posted.
Well, I mean,
to
a
precinct.
mail ballot. I can show you my mail ballot.
Yeah,
Put it, seal up the envelope, and
that's the problem with the vote mail. Yeah.
Yeah. But just for the purposes of this document here, this is just here is a decision that needs to be made. It would better support risk limiting audits, but the reason it's listed here is that it has a big impact on the hardware, because then you need to have some kind of a printer component on the hardware.
Right.
Scanner.
And I was what I was trying to challenge here in this section is the while it is being scanned phrase, because I was like, well, if you look at machines that print like ready-made ballots, then you wouldn't necessarily need to do that. But you're telling me that in California law you do. You can't have the ballot generating machine generate the ID number, because then it's visible before it's cast.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. That's very annoying, because then that has some weird requirements of the hardware.
Yeah, I mean, it might, and maybe the hardware, it gets scanned, and then and then it moves a little bit further, and then a separate disconnected component prints a number on it.
Right.
Separate from the.
I would advocate for like greater auditing capability of the system at the expense of complexity within reason.
Yeah,
Well, then,
I mean,
you would be in favor of this.
Yeah.
also we don't need to make this decision now,
No.
right? Like this is just a documents decision, but it is easy. It is. This is much more of a complicated issue than I thought it was, and thank you for clarifying that, Chris.
So, and then I'll just keep moving here. So this is more of kind of like an ideal requirement. Like this idea of end-to-end verifiability has been floated around. This involves some cryptography stuff that currently there are no, and this actually started with the Travis County system. Is one that was one of its big selling points, was that it would be end-to-end verifiable. But you can have this feature even with paper ballots. And so, I mean, maybe San Francisco's open source system could be end-to-end verifiable, but that would add complexity.
Speaking of glossaries, by the way, that's definitely something you would need to define.
But I mean, that system is the exact opposite of what you said.
Which,
Well, because you can hold up your QR code and boom, it says, yeah, this ballot's been cast.
no, well, no, so the end-to-end verifiable.
No, I'm just saying what the Travis County, what they're advertising on their website.
Well, I think it may do that in a way that does not allow someone to sell their vote. Like it's not.
Because you can do that, right? You can take, even as a simple solution, you can take the ballot ID and encrypt it with the public key of the city, say, of the software. Then a layman or like a third party can't derive from the QR code that you got what the original ballot ID was, but the software can, because it can decrypt that data. Or you can assign a different ID and just keep it mapping it. You keep secret or something
There's
like
some fancy math. I mean, this is like.
Well, anyway, one of the things I was proposing to work on was like a more detailed analysis of each of these other systems that just describe a little, what the features are.
Yeah, could be useful.
And
One of the things that I would really like to see in a later version of this section, and I already wrote it, I think the Travis County system does exactly what 5212 says. Like, it does print a unique identifier in the ballot. So one thing that would be nice to have in a future version of this section, and maybe that's one way to do what you said, Carl, is to for each of these things identify how each of the existing systems that we looked at handle it. And that in turn might give us inspiration for more things in here that are sort of key decision points.
Well, and the other thing that I was interested in working on was addressing some of these security issues and associating with different options. You could do this or this or this, and these are the security implications, all the way down to electronic cast vote records and how those are handled, and it could include end-to-end verifiability. I'm not sure just how to structure that document. But,
Well, I think would it affect how the system is developed?
Well, it's sort of just, I think that discussion is, security, auditability, integrity is, one of the requirements. So I thought it would be good to analyze those issues and how they affect different options that people would have in terms of implementation. And also the options affect how, what kind of equipment can be used and so forth. So you kind of hit on some of those here.
Yeah, if you have an idea of something you'd like to write up, then I would say go ahead and do it.
Okay.
And then bring it, just, let the two of us, let me know far enough in advance so we can put it on the agenda.
Yeah.
So, and then there's some bullets on open source, software architecture, and then, okay, yes.
So, where did we go? Yeah, so the problem is compatibility of licenses. So if you have, a GPL v3 component, it doesn't coexist well with, say, an Apache or an MIT license component. So somebody has to think for each deliverable that the collection of licenses governing the components of that software work harmonically together and not in violation of the license itself. So I thought that the first bullet point didn't really say that as clearly as it might.
Well, it's not trying to say that.
Okay.
But I think that could be an additional one.
All right.
So actually you can use, you can have a GPL3 license, and it could in turn use an Apache license, but not vice versa.
Yeah, but an MIT license component it can, for example.
What's that?
So I think also the word developed is in here, right? Each software component being developed should be licensed under an OSI-approved license. You might want to actually include a specific bullet point here about software components that are being reused from elsewhere. I mean, of course, it's challenging to do that if they don't have already open source license anyway, but you might want to explicitly call it out.
Maybe that could be in
And-
the first bullet then.
Sure, but then software that's reused from elsewhere, like previously existing software, doesn't necessarily need to be GPL v3, just probably needs to be GPL v3 compatible, which MIT, for example, is one-way compatible.
Which would be V2.
Or yeah, exactly.
Because the Linux kernel itself is V2.
Yeah, and you know, like if anything uses the web, you're probably going to use jQuery, for example. That's MIT licensed, and that's one-way compatible with GPL as well.
And React too.
Yeah, exactly. No,
React is a whole
no,
other
React is Preact is. Yeah, no.
Yeah, that's a whole other issue.
Nobody talk about ZFS now.
Okay, so then there's you got license compatibility and then the fact that if it's something we're building on, it doesn't, we can weaken the license
Yeah,
requirements.
it just needs to be compatible because nobody. I think it's unreasonable for us to say like, well, you can't use jQuery because it's not GPL v3. Like that's crazy, right?
Yeah, do we want to come up with language now, or should this be a to-do?
I'm fine making it to do personally.
Do you want to write this up?
I will write it as a to-do for myself. I just 1 second, sorry.
Or do you want to write one of this up? Or?
No, that's okay.
I have another comment on this section. Sorry, before we move on. So I'll,
as do I. Go ahead.
okay. So in the final bullet point, Chris, you used the phrase open source software language. I think you mean a programming language because you say it later on, but it would be good to also define.
Is there a difference? Okay.
Not really. I've just never heard anyone use the term software language. Like maybe other people use it, and I've just never met them. But
Yeah, okay.
that's fine. It's I was like, huh.
I had the same thing. And then,
But then also I think you might want to define a little bit more what that means.
Oh, okay.
What I think you mean is something like this an open source interpreter or compiler exists for this language, and like the software that will be written will actually compile and run in that interpreter. Because, for example, like something like PHP, for example, is a perfectly open source language because there's only one interpreter. Well, there's only two interpreters for it, and they're both open source.
Would you like to write this up?
I will write this up too.
So, but Ron, you have to add one more thing, which is that it has to run on an open source platform. So
Yes,
that-
exactly. You have to, because Java, for example,
It
arguably,
changed this month.
right.
Because the Eclipse Foundation has it now.
But open source runtimes for Java exist.
Yes.
But it is possible to write Java that doesn't run in them, that does run in closed source platforms.
Yep.
So that's one where you want to be careful. With JavaScript, for example, you don't have this problem because, closed source JavaScript runtimes also exist, but the ones that are widely regarded as like if your software runs and it doesn't run in this, it's probably not JavaScript, are open source ones.
Well, I mean, it gets very, very bad with all this virtualization of Docker and Kubernetes and the like, because now you have languages written to run in a virtual environment using unknown components that are all packaged together to run on an open source platform. So it's going to get ugly.
Although Docker is actually a good way to distribute,
As-
or assemble known
Absolutely,
packages.
and that's probably guidance that we want to use. It might be that if we want to encourage widespread adoption, the ability to deliver the solution to other jurisdictions would be that we deliver it in something that's compatible with Docker or Kubernetes or something that.
And then if you write it in C, you can validate everything, and you don't have to rely on interpreters
As
and
long as
all
you
that
don't write it
stuff.
in Haskell.
Yeah, well, CS
You
has
missed
more
that last
security.
night.
It's harder to be secure with C.
Yeah, I mean.
What's that?
Oh yeah, I know what you're talking about.
It's harder to be secure with C though.
Well, yeah,
Depends
because
how you use it.
the unconstrained pointer problem in C, it does has lent itself for 40 years to unpleasant loopholes.
Okay.
Okay.
But I think, we're clear. On
Yeah, I
this.
think I wrote up some to-dos, so let's move on.
And then, so I have here, this is a little bit different from the point that Tony was making earlier, but not that we should be reusing components that are out in the wild, but rather that within the project itself, we should be reusing components across different areas. So let's just verbalize there. This next one under software development, this is actually in response to the San Francisco Chronicle. There's a quote in there from a person which I feel like it's a straw man. It says something
Mhm.
like, how can enough volunteers be, how can it recruit enough volunteers to ensure this? I don't think the assumption was ever that we're gonna be
Yeah.
relying.
But I think it opens up the topic of like who oversees things. Like I imagine that during the development phase, the vendor or vendors doing the development would like exercise oversight over their respective repositories. I think we could write that in there, but I think that's likely to be something that everyone agrees on. But it might be worth thinking about later in some future discussion about like what happens to those repositories after they're delivered and who is the overseer of changes in those repositories going forward.
Yeah,
That's not very clear.
I think we have a section, I think it's called something like maintenance under recommendations.
Okay.
That currently has nothing in it.
I have no particular recommendations in the area, but I think it's something that we should discuss at some point.
Yeah, and I don't particularly feel that the vendor has to release the code for everybody to see until they reach a certain phase of the development. I don't personally feel that they have to make it available to everybody from day one to, what did you do this week, being week one. I think that it complies with the license if they release it in phases that correspond, for example, to the deliverable phase.
Why?
Well, they could do it because there's certain overhead to maintaining nightly builds and stable releases and all of that.
But I would argue that,
I mean, I like it, but I don't view it as a must-have.
but I think there's benefits. I'm not a software engineer, but like from what I've seen and trying to advocate for open source for the government is when you're working in the open from day one, like you're building, I think this is mentioned in the archive, I saw that there's a quote, systems like being designed for like inspection, like it promotes like good working processes and methods that maybe adds to a better product in the end. Plus like the spirit of what we're trying to do here. I think if you were only going to make the code available until a certain deliverable, undermines the point of working in it.
And I think there's actually studies about that like there tends to be less dramatically terrible open source code out there because people are embarrassed about it. Really
Just embarrass them into good quality.
That's what I was getting at.
As I
decent
said,
quality,
I
at
don't
least.
have it.
But-
It's fine if they do that, but.
And it's even common to have, 0.1 release where, 80% is still missing and,
But we
buggy.
can do that, but the question is, do we have to make them release 004?
Well,
Oh no, I think you should just if you just version it in public, like not every nightly release has to run, right? Like it happens all the time.
Right.
Nightly builds break.
Fine.
Right.
Then
It has to be developed in
we're-
public.
We're on the same,
yeah,
we're on
there's
the
a difference
same.
between committing publicly
Right.
and releasing every.
Exactly.
Fine, good, we're all in agreement then.
All I think we're really saying is like the Git repository needs to be viewable by the public at any time.
Right.
Whether when you pull it actually builds or not is a separate question.
Don't you do some terrible thing to the developer who breaks the bill?
And there's like automated nerf guns and stuff like that. Yeah.
Or the
I thought
Should be
modern
well
programming,
documented,
you're
too.
required to break
Right.
the build.
Yeah.
Okay, so this language is here, and
Do you want to talk about 512?
so this is just sort of a very easy one, but
I had a comment on it, which is why I wanted you to talk about it.
okay, yeah. So this is just the idea that I think it's good to have real election data from past elections that can be used to test what they're developing. Yeah.
So one thing that I think we might want to do a cursory search of whether such data sets are easily discoverable. One in particular that I'm curious about is the paper that I mentioned before for the risk limiting audit thing, where I described the Merced mayor election, where they like made scans of all the 7,000 ballots and like shipped them to some PhD student elsewhere in California. Like that's a data set that could really plausibly like exist somewhere and that might be open.
But also using that data set for successive releases, because then what you're doing is you're testing successive releases to mean that they still work.
Regression
Regression
tests.
testing.
Yeah.
Regression testing is a best practice.
Okay.
And we may want to
Yeah.
say something good
I'm,
about regression testing.
For next month's meeting, I'm also going to sneak in a thing somewhere to say something about reproducible builds, so we'll talk about it next
Okay.
month.
Is there, do we anticipate like having to, I know that there's like a major driver for this effort is to have an open source voting system. We talked about that, but I do wonder if people will second guess whether or not they want to assume the risk because not everyone understands open source. And some people view open source as inherently less secure. Like the idea that anyone can see the code and like not understanding the ins and outs of that may make people think that this is inherently a less secure system. And I'm wondering if like our document needs to have like a sort of a discussion around like the value of open source from a security, like how it's more secure or how it invites practices that make it more secure or
We
something.
can also point to the covariety studies, which have gone over this for years.
So I don't know. I don't know if it deserves to be in this document, but I guess my question is open: is like, do you anticipate having to fight that battle?
I mean, it's something that comes up whenever an article gets written, is it's more secure. Personally, I think too much focus is placed on that, just because the answer has been said so many times.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's worth including a section in here. It's
And-
not a recommendation so much
Right.
as just
Value.
And we can also reference the resolutions that the Elections Commission has already passed on this. And
maybe like an FAQ or something.
yeah, an FAQ is actually a great idea. But also, like, it doesn't even need to be more secure, right? It just needs to be not less secure. Because I think the point is transparency, not security. Or the primary motivation. Not less secure, but like really, I think that's the minimum that needs to be.
No worse than.
Exactly, no, but really,
Well,
like that is.
Well, there's that. I mean, it depends on how big you want to go with this, but there's also like business benefits, right? Like,
Mhm.
aren't there studies around like open source software like lowers your software development and maintenance costs in theory,
Yeah.
right? Because of the ability to reuse and.
Yeah, and I guess another thing that we don't spell out as much, and I don't know to what extent we consider it as a goal, but this is certainly why I brought up, for example, the open hardware stuff, is that another beneficial side effect and possible motivation for making this an open source system is that another jurisdiction can, at minimal expense, reproduce it. And in theory, if their elections worked exactly the same as San Francisco's, they could just like buy a bunch of hardware and take the software and just run it. And in practice, they might have to tweak things here and there, but I think one of the possible goals here is to maximize like that reusability.
Right.
And that's a big money saver because there are like, I don't know how many counties in California, probably like dozens,
Yeah.
less than 100. Right, that sounds about right. Yeah.
Agree.
Okay. So where are we now with this?
I think we've gotten to the end of this section, and I don't think anyone's proposed any real changes here.
I mean, I know the only change I've written down is change software language to programming language.
Okay, sure. But
Which is a minor one, but
if you, I would have been happy to approve it and submit a pull request for it next month. But
yes. So
either's fine.
Okay, are people? Let's do public comment on this item.
Mm-hmm.
No?
I will offer a few comments, starting with your section 3, assumptions. The second item that you're adding really sounds to me like more a statement of fact, conformable fact that the record of elections, and so. And this is something
Beginning of the
you don't have to change tonight, but you could either, it might be worthwhile having a separate section that this is a foundation that we're building on, and here are the facts that do it, rather than an assumption, but you're fine. On your key decisions, I think one of the goals here should be trying to avoid upfront decisions that have wide-ranging impact on the system. And so, for example, this issue about what kind of ballots and that sort of thing. I think maybe it's a later agenda item we have tonight. You actually talk about how can we get started with this voting system without dealing with in-person voting, and so that we can maybe put off those decisions, or conversely, how can we build this voting system so that it could easily be expanded to support other options. But so I would challenge whether this issue about what kind of ballot you're using is actually something that has to be done, has to be addressed up front. Likewise, printing unique identifiers. I think that's maybe an important thing to do, but there's a whole heck of a lot of things you can do with even a precinct scan or a single scan that don't depend on those decisions, and that could allow that decision to be deferred. In terms of keeping this project somewhat manageable and being able to complete it sometime before 2032, I would recommend that you just take out the issue of end-to-end verifiability. That's an example of in my mind, trying to reinvent or significantly advance what current practice is beyond open source. And I think those are things that you want to avoid setting yourself up for. And I think that's it.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chris?
Yes.
Two things. I would second this thing about not shooting for the moon with the end-to-end verifiability. There's a long report written a year and a half ago about this, and they're not nearly there. Two, about the identifiers on ballots that are done. I talked to somebody from Texas on Tuesday. They have a practice in Texas for 100 years where you come in and there's ballots on the table, each with a number on it that you can't see. You pick one randomly, and you vote on it. And that intrigued me as something you can number a ballot, but nobody can predict what that number on the ballot is going to be for you, so it's still anonymous. And I could imagine somehow if you're using the voting touchscreen thing, you could do the same thing of, here's 5 numbers, pick one. And that goes on the ballot. So it's just intriguing, and the lawsuit in Texas is specifically on thou shalt number the ballots, and Austin, Texas wasn't. So that's it.
I actually don't understand the thing you just said.
You come in to vote about Texas.
Yeah.
You come in to vote, and they have at the table, pick up one of the 4 ballots on the table. They each have a number that is, if you will, random. You can't see the number when you look at the 4 ballots, but you pick up the one, and that's the number in the ballot, and you go vote on it. And you can remember how you voted. So theoretically, later on in an inquiry, they could bring that ballot back up.
How's it going?
Great.
Nice, just checking to see what's going on. Thank you, guys. Enjoy.
They can bring the ballots back up, and this is how you voted. Because you remember, or you note down what ballot number you had, but it's a random number, it's not a sequential thing.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I think we were saying that that's not legal in California.
Yeah, that sounds like it.
Okay,
Okay.
well, apparently by law requiring Texas.
Okay. All right.
I had one more question, by the way, if public comment is otherwise finished.
Do you want to say anything? Okay. Okay.
All right. Just going back, something I wrote down and forgot to mention, in just like when we were talking about ballot data sets. Does San Francisco store ballots for elections for some time after the election?
In physical form?
In physical form, yeah.
Oh.
Or in any form, really, but
They do. I don't know. I think by law they have to be preserved by a certain number of months. Actually, do any of you know?
22 months for federal elections.
Uh-huh.
And I think it may be the same for California.
Right.
I don't know if they're allowed to open those boxes or not.
That's true, but it means that there is still, like, in a warehouse somewhere, there is still, like, all the ballots from the previous election sitting somewhere. If it is legal to mine them, that is another very relevant source of test ballots, because it would also include RCV ballots, for example.
So you're suggesting that be a part of the project to create this data set? So like to take a precinct, for example, and scan all the ballots?
I wasn't even thinking about the.
I mean, this is purely my suggestion, but I'm saying if it is easy and legal for San Francisco to create a data set, then it could generate the most relevant data set on the planet for this project.
Oh, I would qualify that because, I mean, it might not be that relevant if the ballot that's designed is a lot different.
That's true. That's true.
But at least, especially in terms of scaling,
Yeah.
that if you build, the first version of the system is compatible with what is currently being used, then that's like the best way to phase it in. So it still seems like that's a relevant data set, at least in that context.
Although that system will have been phased out by the time.
Yeah.
We're gonna have a new system.
Yeah.
But let's yes.
To my knowledge, one, it takes a judge's order to unseal those ballots.
All right.
And it's only if you suspect something nefarious. Two, at least as a couple years ago, somebody was proposing a bill that after the 22 months, these ballots be donated to universities or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
The law at that point said they shall be destroyed. So the data set could be a little bit difficult to.
Right. So how do you think Merced did this? Were they able to do it because they did it contemporaneously?
I'm sorry?
So do you think that Merced was able to do it because they did it contemporaneously?
Humboldt,
Like-
are you talking?
No, Merced. The
But
city
they did
of
it
Merced.
as part of an audit.
Right. They did it. Oh, I guess they did it as part of an audit. It was a real audit too, but like I
Yeah,
guess
it
they
was a
also
real
did it
audit.
like
It
right
wasn't
at the
just
election
getting
time.
data.
Yeah, that too. It was a true audit, and I guess they did it right at the election time too, which.
There is a clause in the law that says if the registrar suspects anything's wrong, they have the right to unseal
Okay.
boxes
Right.
during the camp.
Yeah, the Humboldt County, it was the registrar, she was cooperative, that allows the independent scanning of the ballots and all that.
Okay,
She
cool.
was using that clause.
So,
She is using that clause.
During the canvas. Though.
Yeah, so once they're sealed, which they like to rush off and do.
So the way to do it is probably to use a random number generator to generate
Right.
some n number of ballots that follow the data set, that follow the different things that were voted on in a past election. So
Yeah, perhaps, but I was thinking more of like if there are jurisdictions which have images of physical ballots, especially ones that were completed by humans, not machines,
oh yeah.
then because human variability is not doable by RNG, right? So that would be a wonderful. source
So
of
one of
data.
the things they have to do is pick a set of random precincts to audit. So
Uh-huh.
the question is, could they scan those ballots
Mhm.
and keep that data set?
And it sounds like Humboldt County has been letting people do it before they seal the ballots in the first place. Is that what you were saying?
During the canvass, and she
Right.
used that clause, she uses that clause, saying, I suspect that the result isn't right, let's open up boxes.
So maybe what we could do is recommend that the department for the next election they
For 2018,
say
yeah.
is-
Or at least maybe one of the precincts they audit, they scan.
Oh, right, because you're going to do 1% audit, right?
Well, I think maybe for 100% of the ballots.
Oh, yeah, sure, that too. Yeah, that would be wonderful if that
Saying
could be
there's a-
created in 2018.
I mean, there's a possibility that they can have images of 100% of the ballots.
But it may not be
You mean
sufficient to
all ballots?
Yeah.
All whatever, 500,000 ballots, whatever it is.
Sure, I like my data in big quantities.
Yeah, so I actually want to use one of David Carey's suggestions under key decisions in the first sentence. I think he makes a really good point, because depending on how the project is structured, some of these decisions don't need to be made. So maybe rather than saying that should be made early, it could be changed to that needs to be made at some point.
Mhm.
So.
And because I think what Mr. Carey said too is like you've been trying to list decisions that need to be made really early because they inform everything else. And I think Mr. Carey was arguing, correct me if I'm wrong, that some of these decisions are actually decisions that you should avoid making for as long as possible. Is that a fair representation of what you were saying?
I think you want to allow that possibility.
Mhm.
Yeah, certainly.
I'm not saying that all of us worded that, but like that some of the things were actually in the latter category.
Yeah, so Yeah, I don't think we necessarily want to deliberately postpone them, but maybe just.
Yeah.
We can refine that.
Mm-hmm, sure.
And then I think then, and verifiability, we can, maybe at a future meeting, we could decide to recommend against it, or maybe.
Yeah, right now what you wrote is it should be determined how much additional work would need to be done to make it into verifiable. Oh, okay, it does kind of imply that it's a desirable thing and that we should work towards it, so we might want to revise that.
Well, I meant to decide whether to do it.
Okay, yeah,
how much
yeah.
more work it is. But-
Yeah, that's true.
Okay, all right, so are people comfortable with the motion to approve this as we've done?
Yeah.
All right,
I don't think anyone's actually moved it, so moved.
okay,
Second.
20 seconds. Further discussion? Seeing none, Secretary Chair?
Excuse me. Chris Giudice,
Yes?
Larry Buffando,
Yes.
Carl Hay,
Yes.
Ron Patal,
Yes.
and Tony Watson.
Yes.
It's unanimous.
Okay, so let's go on to the next item.
Item 9, incremental approaches. Discussion and possible action regarding incremental approaches to developing and deploying an open source reporting system.
Okay, actually, before we start this item, does anyone want to take a 3-minute break, or should we just power through?
I'm fine
Well,
with that.
what is this is a lot of stuff that I have not seen before this evening.
Okay,
I don't know that I can.
well, we can talk about it, but
Right.
it touches on a lot of stuff we talked about earlier.
Certainly a 3-minute break would be good. I can stretch for.
Yeah, let's
Yeah.
take a 3-minute break then.
All right.
And reset.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, so call the meeting to order. It's 9:18 p.m. And Secretary Chan, can you reread the agenda?
Item number 9, incremental approaches. Discussion and possible action regarding incremental approaches to developing and deploying an open source voting system.
Okay, so this section is something that I actually think this is probably one of the most important things that we could be helping the project on right now. And because for a long time we've been trying to communicate to the city that it would be helpful to do this project in an incremental way, but up to this point, it hasn't really been articulated how this could be done incrementally. And I think a lot of the officials might not really understand what we mean by incremental. So what this section does is it basically lists out some projects some components that could be built first. That would be things that we could actually use before the entire system is built. And it also sort of has a natural ordering because these are things that kind of have to be built anyways. And are also more like simpler components that would help us building the later stuff. So there's 4 components I have here. There's the results reporter, the vote totaler, which includes RCV tabulation, a software library responsible for interpreting ballot images, and then the main piece would be a central ballot scanner. So if this piece were built, we could count 60% of all ballots with open source software without having to deal with all of the complexities of in-precinct equipment. And
So what's the difference between ballot image interpreter and central ballot scanner other than adding hardware? But I mean, if you build ballot image interpreter, it seems like it
Well,
works for either.
I'll tell you the difference. It's that the ballot image interpreter it's one of the software components that needs to exist in a central ballot scanner. But a central ballot scanner needs a bit more because it needs software to take an image of a ballot. It needs to, and then it would call the ballot image interpreter, and then it might need to respond to the results of the interpreter. Like maybe if it has an overvote, it needs to instruct the scanner to put it in a different bin. And then also, if it's printing identifiers, it might need to call out to a printer. So there's a higher level coordination software component that needs to be written. So it's a big chunk of the software on a central ballot scanner. But the other point is that even if we're going to build a central ballot scanner, it's helpful to separate that out as a separate deliverable because it's used in other hardware components.
So I have one question that I saw here in 5211. The components above could be deployed and used in conjunction with a non-open source interim system. So is that intended to be different from the existing system? Okay. So there's no expectation that we would take some new open source piece and run it, and kind of take out a piece at a time from the existing.
Right, and that's
proprietary
because our existing system it's end of life at the end of 2018.
Okay.
And at that point, we're going to have a new interim system. But the thing you just said about taking out pieces, that can be done with the interim system that replaces what we have now.
Okay, so the new interim system has the necessary interfaces that would be available to.
Well, okay, so there's no interim system yet. I mean, that
Right.
RFP hasn't been issued yet. But I think and we can talk about this. But I think we don't really even need explicit interfaces. I think we could kind of maybe manually, come up with the valid definitions if you needed to. But I guess the main point is that we don't need like full support from the vendor to support these.
Yeah, that's
Parallel.
really the
Yeah.
crux of the issue.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I mean, it might be wise to include you won't sue us over this support, but
Right, and we actually have that in one of our recommendations. It's
okay. I didn't realize it was already in there.
under interim system. It's
Cool.
But these monolithic systems, we've had decades of experience with that.
I have another question about 5211. You mentioned that we can take advantage of SB 360 from 2013. What does SB 360 allow us to do?
It's HAVA funds, right?
This was the legislation for California that enabled vote centers.
Oh,
Okay.
And actually, I wish, maybe, do you know, David? Like, I think there's.
360? 360 was the one that allowed
Oh, I'm
California to independently certify its own system.
Yeah, I'm sorry. That makes sense.
Right, because what
450?
so what it says here that 360 would let us do apparently is have some of the vote by mail ballots in some sort of pilot scanned by the open source
Let me
system.
just pull it up here.
Yeah, 360 was the one that said, started setting some parameters for doing pilots.
Okay, yeah. Not yet certified.
Non-proprietary voting system components.
Okay.
And I think it is said that essentially the Secretary of State can provide some kind of temporary approval for that kind of piloting process for non-proprietary voting.
Right,
systems.
when the system is not yet certified.
Yeah, and maybe it's like,
When it's not yet certified, because what it says here that we could do is that San Francisco could run a pilot where some percentage of the vote by mail ballots are scanned by the system prior to its being certified.
So it's it's still, my understanding is, as I recall, I'll check it, it still requires an approval
Right.
from the Secretary of State, and may involve some testing by the Secretary of State. But the idea is that it's not the full-blown
Right.
system. and-
Whereas, because presumably if it was certified, you would just be allowed to use it.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. I also have a remark on item 3, but I think Chris might still be looking up what SB 360 did.
I think there's like a threshold, like if it's used in a certain percentage of precincts, you don't need certification. It's like
Okay.
15%. Jim, do you remember SB 360? Like under what conditions are voting systems allowed to be used, not certified? The pilot projects.
That was 360, and it was in 4 pilot projects the Secretary of State had to approve, whatever that means. And they had to have a risk limiting audit accompanying it.
And what, sorry?
A risk limiting audit
Ah,
for the pilot.
interesting.
Was it a certain number of
Win-win.
percentage of precincts?
I think it's not more than half the precincts in the jurisdiction. That's in
Half?
the pilot. But I'm not totally sure. This is several years ago.
Interesting. That's a high number.
Yeah.
Because he was like, is it 10% or something?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
I mean, I have possibility of looking it up.
Yeah, but maybe that's very interesting and very good to hear that is
We were
feasible.
worried that they were going to just have an infinite number of pilots all the time out throughout the county,
Mhm.
and we wanted some brakes put on them. We got them.
Yeah, actually here it says, in no event shall the number of voting system units exceed 50% of the estimated number of units that would be required for full deployment of the voting system at every polling place and early voting site.
The number of units. That's a strange way of putting it. Okay.
Yeah, well, so, but I think the point is that there seems to be this ability.
Yeah. But it doesn't, like, yeah, I mean, so maybe this should be researched further and then like edited into this document, but it sounds like you can do pretty interesting things with that. Like if really all it talks about is like the number of units that you would need to run as full system, then it doesn't sound like you would be precluded from like running the entire vote by mail operation through it. Although, of course, if you tell the Secretary of State, like, here are these 4 boxes and they're going to process
I don't think
63% of our vote, then he might complain.
I don't think that's the intent.
I'm sure that's not the intent, yeah. But,
Yeah, I mean, well, so what bullet number 2 currently says is that
yeah, some of it.
some of it before certifying. And then-
Yeah, and now that you mention it, that is actually pretty good summary of what SB 360 says you can do.
Does that mean that you could take the Prime 3 system and put it in some precincts as an accessible device? Just as is? I mean, I'm thinking Prime 3 actually might satisfy the requirements other than not being sort of...
Yeah, so this is interesting. The thing with Prime 3, though, is that it would be generating ballots that can't be scanned by the precinct scanners that we would be using. So the thing is, they would probably need to be remade. You know,
Yeah.
it's not actually the casting part of the voting system. It's just
Or you couldn't use it until you had a scanner that could scan.
or they would need to be manually handled.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think the answer is yes. Though. I think it could be.
That's another interesting possibility. I have a comment on number 3 there, where you're saying that the open source scanners could be used to scan vote by mail ballots in addition to the interim system scanning them. So this is maybe going slightly less far than what Humboldt County apparently allows, where just like random researchers can scan all the ballots. I really like your pointing that out, because you could presumably, prior to them being certified, scan everything with them, or at least all of the vote by mail, which is like almost 2/3 of the vote anyway, without needing any sort of certification if you're not seeing that's the official result. What I like about it is that it's almost a transitive audit as well, which isn't explicitly called out there, but that makes me question when we report vote totals in San Francisco, do they break out how the vote by mail ballots broke? So in theory, you could actually audit that sub result, right? Not that it would necessarily, not that all your like RLA techniques would work because you don't have a meaningful winner for a sub for that portion of the election, but you could say like, well, the open source voting system, the open source scanners reported this tally for the vote by mail component, and the proprietary system reported this, and they're like only off by 3 votes or something, so it's probably right.
Yeah.
That's it's another interesting thing that we could do there.
So I was just, a general comment, one of the sort of components actually might need to be figuring out all the data formats
Yeah.
and kind of pinning those down so that the different modules can work together. So, I mean, that might just even be its own mini project. I mean, you kind of imply it in this, but maybe it's even worth making it explicit
I mean, as sort of a dependency.
as a deliverable.
Okay.
So you're.
Well, under the later sections, it actually has other outcomes / deliverables, and this is at the end of this,
Oh,
and for each one.
I mean, you mentioned data formats under each one, but I'm just saying an overall,
Okay.
working it out as just like you divide the project up into modules. That's sort of one task, but then figuring out the data formats and how the data flows and what's in them, and so if your tallier needs to, you can't work on a tallier if you don't know what the image analysis software is going to produce and so forth.
Yeah, well, so.
I mean, it's not a hard thing to do, but
Well, there's one thing I want to say. So one thing is, one approach could be you wait for the format to be defined and then you build the software against that format. Or you build the component, and one of the deliverables is you have to spell out the format it uses, and then you can have like a converter component. So the second approach allows you to get started quicker, and then in case you forget to spell something out in the requirements, you're not shooting yourself in the foot. So you understand those two approaches?
say it again.
Sorry. So one approach could be, I want you to build this results reporter, and I'm going to spell out a complete spec of what you need to accept for the input. And then another approach is, I want you to build a results reporter, but you tell me the data you need, and you can specify the format it needs to come in. And then that second approach will let the vendor get started earlier. And then,
Maybe.
well, but also.
If you did deployments, if you did contracts in parallel, then you'd need to have the.
I think it's not that hard to come up with the formats.
Well, but the thing is, if in the RFP you leave something out, and then they're like, oh, we can't.
I'm not saying they have to be legally obligated to those formats. It's just, version 0.1, of the interface, the documentation.
Okay.
I mean, it's not saying you have to build a thing that does this. It's like, somebody's worked out, here's a plan for the data format is not finalized.
Okay, yeah.
But yet we have a starting point
Yes.
that everyone can work on. And if you don't, otherwise you're waiting for one to do this. But if you just do a project, I mean, it's maybe only a few days worth of work, but
Okay, so you're saying that you'd want to have, like, as just describe the task of defining these things in advance.
and also the data that it works with.
Okay.
So.
Well, once you figure out all the data, now the modules pop into place.
So I want to come back to this notion of advisory, as a technical advisory committee. It seems that as we all talk about this, we have a pretty good idea of how to go about building this system. And something that would perhaps save some time and money for whoever gets the contracts. I used the plural there because who knows. Can we make that happen? Either that some of this information becomes background to the RFP so that the bidders know, kind of get some additional information about how to structure the task and what's really involved and how we recommend they go about it. Or is that kind of off the plate? I mean, how do we put into use this valuable insight that you have?
Yeah, well, we could, we're going to have recommendations, and we could highlight, like, we're very strongly recommending these ones, and then, or like these ones are less important, and then make that known to the commission, and then the commission could say, hey, we want the department to do these strong recommendations, and then they're highlighted that way, and then basically, I mean, anything that we think is important, we can have that communicated, and I'm on the commission,
Yes.
and we could make sure it's known. And then also something related that I didn't state before, but one of the reasons what we're doing is important is because as this consulting firm comes on, if we didn't exist, they might come out with a report in January that's like, oh, you know, the only way to do this is you have to build these complex hardware components and it's going to cost you $10 million. And then by coming up with this document, you know, they can't say that there aren't incremental ways to do this. So we're sort of
Right.
So there's some timing as to when we get this and make it available to the consulting firm.
well, it's available to them now. I mean, they can be looking at our website.
Okay. They can be, but
Well, I mean,
Well, it hasn't
I
even
mean,
been
if-
finalized yet, so.
yeah, that's true. I mean, if you have a consulting firm that's being paid $200,000 and there's like a committee actively meeting on the very topic that they're advising on, you'd think that they would.
Sure, if they know about it, which I'm sure Director Arns can be directed to make sure that they do,
Yeah.
if the commission hasn't already done so.
okay,
So,
I'm good.
can I say something that may not be constructive, but this as being one of the more important sections of probably this report, like, do we want to defer this to a future meeting or keep powering through on this because I feel like there's a lot here still for us to cover?
Well, so this is, well, this is up to the committee. I mean, I would love it if the committee accepted it. I think it helps to have stuff, you know, being approved earlier because once the firm is hired. But,
Yeah.
But I think we could also revise it
Yeah.
and add to it in the future, so.
Mhm.
I mean, that's what we've been doing all evening is we've been approving as a .01 or
Right, but,
.5
yeah,
the documents that have been drafted with the expectation that they're going to get revised.
right.
If you want to add like extra caveats to this section, for example, because you feel that it's,
No, so like,
then I would be
Or
okay
do you
with
need
that.
more time to review it, or?
Well, I
or
thought we were going to keep going through the rest of the section. I was just trying to emphasize that I think it's a section that deserves like considerable thought and discussion. I'm totally in favor of accepting what we have
Okay.
here, then returning back to it
Mhm.
in detail. I didn't know how far we were going to go into it tonight,
All right.
and I think that this being the last thing, one of the last things on the agenda, didn't deserve to be shortchanged because we spent more time on some of the
Mhm.
others in terms of conversation.
Yeah, I would be perfectly okay with coming back to it and perhaps there'll be, another round of changes
Yeah.
that people want to propose between now and.
Because there's a lot here.
Yeah, definitely. So maybe we can have an agenda item for next month to discuss this section again.
Yeah.
And regardless of whether we approve it now or not, you know, of course, people can write change requests that we will also discuss next month,
And
but,
also, it's not, if we approve something, there's nothing saying we can't, like, change. It's not like we have to live with everything. You know, it's,
we have to live with it being on the website for a month.
right.
I mean, that's the real consequence, right?
But again, even if it's on the website for a month, nothing's gonna be happening between now and the next meeting where it's gonna be irreversible, like,
Mhm.
no decision is gonna be made, I think.
Right. The consulting firm is gonna have like 2 or 3 weeks of having their contract signed. Because that was like maybe end of next week.
But I mean, but having said that, if there's something that you're thinking about or that you see that you think you might not agree with, then you can, then, we could make an adjustment now.
Mhm.
Yeah, fine with this.
So Chris, do you happen to know if sample ballot PDFs are posted on the current election website for past elections?
I know that the voter pamphlets are posted on the website, and then many of those have, some of the pages are sample ballots.
Well, I mean, the way they used to do it is, there was one giant PDF that was the whole bloody thing.
But yeah, and then I guess they leave out those pages.
But then I don't know if they're stored no, they include the sample ballot pages.
Well, but it varies by precinct, so I think they can't have it.
Yeah, so you have like ballot type 1 PDF, ballot type 2 PDF, and so forth. But I know they do that for the recent election, but I don't know if they're for past elections.
Well, I don't know, that's actually, I don't know. That's
Hmm.
But I mean, that's sort of one source of like test data is
Sample ballots
extracting
is
the
a good one.
PDF pages.
Although those PDFs have like sample written across diagonally, so.
Well, it still could be used. That's one of the requirements of the software. It has to be able to deal with sample ballots, scans.
Well, I'm all for taking, for accepting this as a set of recommendations and agreeing that we will continue to revisit this and other
Yes.
and other sections that will, I don't know whether it's to make them routinely part of the agenda for the next couple of meetings so that we are continuously reminded that we have the opportunity to modify the documents.
Yeah, and then just so people are clear on the process, that, you know, by like about 10 days before the meeting, aim for 10 days, you let me know like what sections you want to make changes to, and then the agenda will be like the sum of all the sections. And then you just make them available to the group, you know, 3 or 4 or 5 days before that. Let's see. Okay.
So you want to know which sections 10 days before, and you want actual diffs like 5 days before.
Yeah, this, you know, you're just to make it just thinking that it's us who need to be reading this at time. So
Yeah, sure, yeah.
it's more material.
Yeah.
Okay. So, oh, and the other thing I wanted to mention, like, I think maybe one change for this section we might even consider is, like, I know, you know, some people feel very strongly about the prime 3 voting system. Like, maybe one of the early things could be, you know, trying it out. They say it's ready, so maybe, is it actually easy for the department to use? Could they use it in a few precincts? And they say no software has to be written for it. That could be another early, you know, thing to work on. Okay, so take public comment on this item. No?
I'll just encourage you to not just talk the talk, but walk the walk. And the strongest sales job for incremental agile development is to do it with your own process.
Okay. Thank you. All right, so do we have a motion to adopt this, or?
As the broken record person for this section, I will move that we adopt it. I've only mentioned it like 10 times this meeting, right?
I second.
You're gonna be racking up all the motion points.
Sorry, yeah, no,
It's fine.
I felt like not hogging it, but also felt like this section I just had to be.
Okay. All right, any remaining discussion? Seeing none, Secretary Chan?
Okay, Chris Giordano,
Yes?
Larry Mafundo,
Yes.
Carl Hay,
Yes.
Rowan Cattell,
Yes.
Tony Wasserman,
Yes.
it's unanimous.
Okay, and so the last item.
Item 10, topic for future discussion.
Okay. So we don't have to, you know, say everything in this item, but if people want to reiterate things or new things you thought of, or it's up to you.
I think we can make it explicit if we want to revisit these agenda items in 9,
Okay.
or 7, 8, and 9 at the next meeting
Okay.
to see if there
Well,
are
6, 7, 8, 9.
yeah, to see if there are proposed changes, reactions.
Okay. Anything else?
I already mentioned it before, but there's a few things that I'll work on, so,
Great.
and I'll post it ahead of time so that we can discuss it.
And I would like to hear from you on the meeting in Berkeley.
Okay.
And with it to discuss the extent to which others of us should make similar presentations given the opportunity. I mean, do we want to keep a low profile until this is further underway, or do we want to get out there and say, hey, this is what we're working
I
on?
think we should make some noise. I mean,
Okay,
we can talk about that.
then the idea of having, so it would be to include a review of the presentation that you used, because it helps if we all talk from the same text.
Okay, so that, we can have that be an item then.
Yeah.
We can have an item about that.
Oh, by the way,
Yes.
I recommend that anyone who hasn't read that LAFCO report, read it, because there's a lot of interesting stuff in it.
Does it work if I put it under my pillow and?
Yeah.
It's a bunch of text and I skimmed it, but yeah, there's a bunch of good stuff in there. I'll probably also attend at least some of the Berkeley conference.
Okay, great. And then I think a very important topic for the next meeting, this, so you're confident that you can help get us closer towards some procurement processes, I think.
Yeah, that would be good.
And,
Although I'm not sure if it'll manifest in a speaker or if
Okay.
it'll manifest in contributions from them in written form.
and lastly, maybe lastly, if the contract has been awarded officially, the ability to review the bid and.
Okay.
Yeah, I think yesterday not yesterday, but the previous, not yesterday's meeting with the commission, but the one before that, I think Director Arndt said that someone asked like when would the RFPs become public, and I think he said it would be at some point after the contract was signed, right? Like eventually all the RFP responses become public?
Very, like, within a day or two, I think.
Okay, cool. So that will happen like within the next 2 weeks or so. So for at the time of the next meeting, all the RFP responses from all the bidders, not just the winning one, will be publicly viewable, so we might want
I think we
to
probably want to
review
look
that.
closely at the winning one.
yeah.
Yeah, okay, so that'll be on the agenda.
All right.
So that, it would be most convenient if you could add that to the packet for next meeting, Chris.
Okay, I'll do that.
I will very quickly look over my to-dos I wrote down a bunch of things that I want to write change proposals to the document for the next meeting. I might not do all of them, but some of them came up already, like licenses of reused software, licenses for programming languages, custom hardware possibly being open. I also am probably going to work on some language around license for documentation, because I think that's still an open issue, and given that I work at one of the largest former users of the GNU free documentation license, which we got rid of, I have some words to say about that.
Wait, which was?
The GFDL,
Okay.
the GNU's license for documentation. We use it at Wikipedia at first, and we very much got rid of it in favor of Creative Commons because it has some onerous requirements, which I can detail next month. So I'll write some language about that too, and
just as
that's more or less it.
Is it permissible for, if I wanted to see what Ron wrote in between and review and give feedback, is it permissible that he sends me mail and draft copy that I can?
As long as your collaboration doesn't expand to more than 3 people.
I see.
So.
So I would be glad to.
Or even 3, right? 3 is too
Oh,
many
I'm
already.
sorry.
Yeah, there's
Yeah,
5 of us,
2,
so
only 2.
yeah, only 2 can
So I would
collaborate.
be glad to take a look at any draft and give you feedback if you would like to do that.
It's about documentation licensing specifically,
Okay.
or other things too.
You can
All
talk
this
amongst
is,
yourselves.
yeah.
Right, because I can only have one partner for every item, right? So I got to choose carefully.
She applies it,
I have to run shortly.
okay. Okay, so let's do public comments. Yes.
2 things. One, I tried like yesterday to find an email address to the secretary that would then go out to everybody, and I couldn't find it on the website.
So you could just email elections.commission, and that will be forwarded on.
Okay, well, that's what happened with John's proposal yesterday, but I was trying to tell him to send it more to John has his proposal for a design of a new system, and I thought it was more appropriate here than the Elections Commission, but he sent it to the Elections Commission, so, okay.
Okay.
We have been receiving emails from various people that in some cases have just been sent to the secretary directly at donald.chan@sfgov.org. I don't know if Secretary Chan prefers that method of delivery.
If it gets to me, then I just forward it to Chris for his opinion about where it should go. If it goes to the rest of the committee, he'll tell me.
So I thought your email address was on the website.
It is.
It's on the commission website.
But,
On the commission website.
yeah,
Is it on the TAC website?
His isn't, I could add it.
yeah,
Okay.
and that would be uncontroversial for you to add, right? Like, it's just an administrative thing.
Oh, yeah.
But your name is listed as secretary. of
Yeah,
the-
but then people have to dig up your email address, which some people have successfully done, but
Yeah. I mean,
evidently it's not very
I
usable.
tried.
But also, I think there's a good chance that a lot of our email addresses will be on there as individuals, so you could just
Yeah.
be sent to everyone, whoever.
It's a possibility, I'm not sure for, a number of commissioners don't have their email address.
No, this is for the committee members.
Yeah.
Oh, but I see what you're saying.
And the second point is then this conference, it's going to be, I tend not to toot horns that much, it's going to be one hell of a conference. We're flying people in Michigan, Wisconsin, New York, LA, Arizona. The best that I could find on democracy advocates, people that are in the field, most of them are coming. And then these from academia, from verified voting, we're going to have talks about security and auditing. I think Philip Stark will be there, Mr. Risk Limiting Audits. And then Chris is talking. I think that's going to be later Saturday afternoon.
Okay.
And I will pre-announce, please don't tweet this, Chris. The author of AB 840, the infamous AB 840 of let's not bother to audit a third of the ballots, is coming to the conference. Probably 10 to noon on Sunday. We're going to have a call on Saturday about how to deal with this. Because we don't want to massacre them, but we want to reach out and talk to people. So that should be very interesting. The schedule is in my hands and it's not up because it just changed 4 times today. But it'll get up as soon as I can get something stable. So please come. I think you will enjoy it and meet a lot of good people.
Y'all come.
Just briefly, regarding making public the responses to the recent RFP, my understanding was, is that, and I think Director Arns was confirming this at last night's meeting, was that it's only the winning response that will be made. Yeah. I'm not sure if the names of the other responders are already public or will be made public, but I think it's just the winning.
It's fair. I think that's what people are interested in anyway.
Yeah. The other thing, just very, very quick minor point, is I would encourage this group, as you have with the website and your repository on GitHub already, is to as much as possible, use open source tools in what you're doing.
What's not open source right now?
I guess I couldn't say for sure. I didn't look for sure, but one of the documents that was shared today was docx.
Yep.
Oh, I see.
And I didn't, just for the publicity point of it, if it's possible, if people are comfortable doing it, using
So I can
open
tell
source.
you the doc, so he asked me to email him a docx and then he's going to paste it into a markdown.
Mhm.
So it's just an intermediate, it's only for printing actually.
Yeah.
I think it's worthwhile adopting open source tools as much as possible.
And plus I used open source software to create it.
Yeah, I used open source software to read it, but I still shuddered. I still shuddered though. I'll say that.
I use LibreOffice to read it.
Exactly. Me too.
Okay, thank you. All right.
If you read the metadata, you'll see it's.
Okay, so any other comments? It's 9:56 p.m. Seeing no further members of the public. Okay, I'm going to adjourn the meeting. Thank you everyone for attending. Have a wonderful night. Meeting is adjourned. 9:56 p.m.